The Senones emerge from the archaeological record as one of the most significant Celtic tribes of ancient Gaul, their presence first documented through material remains scattered across the fertile river valleys of what is now central France. During the 6th and 5th centuries BC, these Celtic peoples established themselves along the meandering courses of the Yonne and Seine rivers, creating a network of settlements that would serve as the foundation for their eventual expansion across the ancient world. Archaeological excavations throughout the Yonne Valley have revealed extensive evidence of Senones occupation dating to this formative period. At sites such as Vix, near modern Châtillon-sur-Seine, archaeologists have uncovered elaborate burial complexes that speak to the sophisticated nature of early Senones society. The famous Vix burial, discovered in 1953, contained the remains of a high-status individual interred with extraordinary grave goods, including the massive bronze crater that stands as one of the finest examples of ancient metalwork ever discovered. This vessel, standing over 1.6 metres tall and weighing more than 200 kilograms, demonstrates not only the wealth of the Senones elite, but also their extensive trade connections reaching as far as the Greek world. The settlements themselves followed patterns typical of Celtic oppida, with fortified hilltop positions overlooking river crossings and fertile agricultural lands. At Sens, the ancient Agedincum, archaeological layers reveal continuous occupation from the 5th century BC onward. The site's strategic position at the confluence of the Yonne and Van rivers made it a natural centre for trade and political control. Excavations have uncovered substantial timber and stone foundations, indicating permanent structures rather than temporary encampments. Storage pits filled with carbonized grain suggest sophisticated agricultural practices, while workshops containing metalworking debris point to specialized craft production. The material culture recovered from these early Senones sites places them firmly within the broader context of Celtic civilization, specifically the Hallstatt and Latena cultural traditions that dominated much of Iron Age Europe. The Hallstatt period, roughly spanning the 8th to 5th centuries BC, left its mark on Senones territory through distinctive pottery styles, bronzework and burial practices. Hallstatt Sea period fibulae, characterized by their boat-shaped bow and catch plates, appear regularly in Senones graves, alongside iron swords with bronze hilts that became hallmarks of Celtic warrior culture. The transition to Latène culture, beginning around 450 BC, brought significant changes to Senones material culture. Latène artistic styles, with their flowing curvilinear designs and sophisticated metalwork, found expression in Senones craftsmanship. Bronze torques discovered in the region display the characteristic spiralling patterns and animal motifs that define Latène art. These neck rings, often made from twisted gold or bronze wire, served both as personal adornment and symbols of social status. The complexity of their manufacture required specialized knowledge of metallurgy and artistic techniques passed down through generations of Celtic craftsmen. Iron production became increasingly sophisticated during this period, with Senones smiths developing techniques for creating high-quality weapons and tools. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites reveals the use of bloomery furnaces capable of reaching temperatures sufficient to smelt iron ore. The resulting iron was then worked into long swords, spearheads, and agricultural implements that gave the Senones significant advantages in both warfare and farming. The characteristic Latène longsword, with its pointed tip and double-edged blade, became a symbol of Celtic martial prowess and appears frequently in Senones burials of this period. Pottery production also evolved significantly, with Senones craftsmen developing distinctive regional styles, while maintaining connections to broader Celtic traditions. Wheel-thrown ceramics replaced earlier hand-built vessels, allowing for more standardized production and refined forms. Decorative techniques included geometric patterns incised before firing and the application of colored slips that created striking visual effects. Storage vessels, cooking pots, and drinking cups found in settlement contexts demonstrate the full range of ceramic production, while fine tableware from elite burials reveals the highest levels of craftsmanship. The tribal organisation of the early Senones reflected patterns common throughout Celtic Europe, with society structured around kinship groups and territorial divisions overseen by aristocratic elites. At the apex of this hierarchy stood warrior nobles who controlled land, livestock, and the loyalty of lesser tribesmen. These elites demonstrated their status through elaborate material displays, including weapons, jewellery, and imported luxury goods that proclaimed their wealth and connections to distant trading networks. The warrior ethos permeated Senones society, with martial prowess serving as the primary path to social advancement and political power. Young men proved themselves through raids against neighbouring tribes and participation in larger military campaigns. The archaeological record preserves evidence of this warrior culture through the prevalence of weapons in male burials and the artistic emphasis on martial themes in decorative metalwork. Shields, while rarely preserved due to their organic construction, are represented by bronze shield bosses and fittings that demonstrate sophisticated defensive equipment. Below the warrior aristocracy, free farmers and craftsmen formed the backbone of Senones society. These individuals owned land and livestock, participated in tribal assemblies, and could bear arms in times of war. Archaeological evidence suggests significant social mobility, with successful farmers and skilled artisans able to accumulate wealth and status through their efforts. Craft specialization became increasingly important as Senones society grew more complex, with metalworkers, potters, and other specialists developing expertise that commanded respect and compensation. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves and dependent labourers, though direct archaeological evidence for these groups remains limited. Celtic law codes from other regions suggest that slavery existed throughout the Celtic world, typically resulting from warfare or debt bondage. These individuals would have performed agricultural labour, domestic work, and other tasks that supported the lifestyle of their social superiors. Religious practices among the early Senones centred on the natural world and the cyclical patterns of agricultural life. Sacred groves, springs, and hilltops served as focal points for ritual activity, with offerings deposited at these sites to ensure divine favour. Archaeological excavations have revealed votive deposits containing weapons, jewellery, and coins thrown into rivers and springs as gifts to the gods. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water appears to have been particularly important, with the Seine and Yonne rivers yielding numerous Celtic artefacts that likely represent religious offerings. The Druids played a central role in Senones' religious life, serving as priests, judges, and repositories of tribal knowledge. These learned individuals underwent lengthy training that could last 20 years or more, memorizing vast amounts of oral tradition including laws, genealogies, and religious lore. While the Druids left no written records of their teachings, classical authors provide glimpses of their practices and influence. They conducted sacrifices, interpreted omens, and served as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Sacred sites within Senones territory included both natural features and constructed spaces. Hilltop sanctuaries, often located on prominent peaks overlooking river valleys, served as gathering places for religious festivals and tribal assemblies. Archaeological evidence suggests these sites contained wooden temples or sacred enclosures, though stone construction would not become common until the Roman period. Circular ditches and post holes mark the locations of these early sacred structures, while deposits of animal bones and pottery fragments indicate sacrificial activities. The Celtic calendar, based on lunar cycles and agricultural seasons, governed the timing of religious observances. Major festivals marked key points in the agricultural year, including planting, harvest, and the transition between seasons. Samhain, celebrated at the end of October, marked the beginning of winter, and was believed to be a time when the boundary between the living and dead became permeable. Beltane, held in early May, celebrated the return of life and fertility to the land. These festivals brought together scattered communities for religious ceremonies, trade and political discussions that reinforced tribal unity. Burial practices provide crucial insights into Senones' religious beliefs and social organisation. Elite burials from this period often included elaborate grave goods, including weapons, jewellery, and imported luxury items that accompanied the deceased into the afterlife. The positioning of bodies, typically in a crouched or extended position, and the orientation of graves suggest specific beliefs about death and rebirth. Some burials included evidence of ritual feasting, with animal bones and pottery vessels indicating ceremonies held in honour of the dead. The Senones maintained extensive trade networks that connected their territory to distant regions of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Amber from the Baltic, coral from the Mediterranean, and exotic metals from various sources appear in archaeological contexts, demonstrating the far-reaching nature of these commercial relationships. Trade routes followed river valleys and mountain passes, with the Seine serving as a crucial artery connecting the Senones to both Atlantic and Mediterranean markets. The prosperity and growing population density within traditional Senones territories along the Seine and Yonne valleys created mounting pressures that would ultimately drive portions of the tribe toward the Italian peninsula during the early 4th century BC. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals signs of resource strain, with settlement sites showing increased fortification and defensive earthworks that suggest heightened competition for agricultural land and trade routes. The discovery of mass grave sites dating to approximately 400 BC indicates periods of violent conflict, likely resulting from territorial disputes as populations expanded beyond the carrying capacity of established regions. Climate data reconstructed from pollen analysis and ice core samples suggests that the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC experienced a period of cooler temperatures and reduced agricultural yields across much of northern Europe. This climatic shift, known to modern researchers as the Hallstatt oscillation, created additional stress on Celtic communities that relied heavily on grain production and livestock herding. The Senones, despite their sophisticated agricultural techniques and extensive trade networks, found themselves facing the same environmental challenges that affected Celtic peoples throughout Gaul and beyond. Simultaneously, pressure from Germanic tribes moving westward across the Rhine created a domino effect that displaced Celtic populations throughout the region. Archaeological layers from this period show evidence of site abandonment and population movement, with traditional settlement patterns disrupted across wide areas. The Cimbri and Teutones, Germanic peoples documented by later Roman sources, appear to have initiated a series of migrations that forced Celtic tribes to seek new territories or face absorption into expanding Germanic confederations. The allure of Italian lands played an equally important role in motivating Senones' participation in the great Celtic migrations. Stories of fertile valleys, mild climates, and wealthy cities beyond the Alps circulated through Celtic trade networks and warrior bands. Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily had established prosperous settlements that attracted Celtic mercenaries and traders, who returned with accounts of agricultural abundance and urban wealth that far exceeded anything available in Gaul. These reports, combined with knowledge gained through existing trade relationships, painted Italy as a land of opportunity for ambitious Celtic peoples. Political fragmentation within Senones society also contributed to the migration decision. The tribe's decentralized structure, while effective for managing dispersed settlements along river valleys, created competing centers of power that sometimes pursued conflicting interests. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain Senones settlements maintained stronger connections to Mediterranean trade networks, while others remained focused on traditional northern European relationships. This division may have led to factional disputes that encouraged some groups to seek independence through migration, rather than submit to rival authorities within the tribal confederation. The actual crossing of the Alps represented a monumental undertaking that required careful planning and considerable resources. The Senones migration, which began around 390 BC, followed established routes through mountain passes that had been used by traders and small groups for centuries. The Great St. Bernard Pass, known to ancient peoples as the Ponienus Mons, provided the most direct route from Gallic territories to the Po Valley. Archaeological evidence from the pass itself includes Celtic artifacts and coin hoards that likely represent offerings made by travellers seeking divine protection during their dangerous journey. The logistics of moving entire communities, including women, children, elderly individuals, livestock, and household goods, across treacherous mountain terrain, demanded sophisticated organisational capabilities. Senones leaders would have needed to coordinate food supplies, establish temporary camps, and maintain group cohesion during weeks of difficult travel. Evidence from Alpine archaeological sites suggests that Celtic migrants followed a strategy of seasonal movement, timing their crossing to avoid the worst winter weather while ensuring adequate pasturage for their animals along the route. The descent into the Po Valley brought the Senones into contact with established Etruscan settlements and emerging Roman influence in the region. Initial encounters appear to have been relatively peaceful, with Celtic groups possibly serving as mercenaries for various Italian powers before establishing permanent settlements. The rich agricultural lands of the Po Valley, with their fertile alluvial soils and favourable climate, must have seemed like paradise compared to the increasingly crowded and resource-depleted territories they had left behind in Gaul. The Senones established their primary Italian settlements along the Adriatic coast in the region that Romans would later term the Ager Gallicus, or Gallic territory. This area, roughly corresponding to modern-day Marche and parts of Romagna, provided excellent access to both maritime trade routes and the rich agricultural hinterland of the Apennine foothills. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Senigallia and Fano have revealed substantial Celtic settlements dating to the late 4th century BC, with material culture that clearly demonstrates continuity with Gallic traditions while showing adaptation to Italian conditions. The coastal location of these settlements reflected sophisticated strategic thinking on the part of Senones leaders. Control of Adriatic ports provided access to Greek trade networks that extended throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while proximity to river mouths allowed penetration into the Italian interior. The Metaurus, Cesano, and other rivers flowing from the Apennines to the Adriatic served as natural highways for trade and communication, connecting Senones' coastal bases with inland territories rich in agricultural and mineral resources. Interaction with existing Italian populations proved complex and often violent. The Picentes, an Italic people who had controlled much of the central Adriatic coast for centuries, found themselves displaced or subordinated by the arriving Senones. Archaeological evidence suggests a period of coexistence in some areas, with mixed Celtic Piscine sites showing cultural blending and possible intermarriage between the two groups. However, other locations reveal clear evidence of conflict, with burned settlement layers and weapon deposits indicating violent confrontations. The Umbrians, who controlled territories to the west and south of the initial Senones settlements, represented another significant challenge to Celtic expansion. These Italic peoples had developed sophisticated urban centres and military organisations that proved more resistant to Celtic pressure than some of their neighbours. Archaeological evidence from Umbrian sites during this period shows increased fortification and the adoption of Celtic military technologies, suggesting an arms race between the two peoples as they competed for territorial control. Senones' military tactics in Italy reflected adaptations to local conditions and opponents. The traditional Celtic emphasis on individual warrior prowess and fierce charges remained important. but encounters with disciplined Italian infantry required modifications to established fighting methods. Archaeological finds include Celtic weapons modified with Italian features, such as longer spear points and reinforced shield construction that suggest learning from local military traditions. The establishment of alliances with other Gallic tribes in northern Italy became crucial to Senones' success in their new territories. The Boii, who had settled in the western Po Valley around the same time as the Senones migration, shared similar cultural backgrounds and faced comparable challenges in adapting to Italian conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests extensive interaction between Boii and Senones communities, with similar pottery styles, metalwork traditions, and settlement patterns indicating close cooperation and possible intermarriage between the two groups. The Lingones, another Celtic tribe that participated in the Italian migrations, established themselves in territories adjacent to both the Boii and Senones. This geographic proximity facilitated the formation of a loose confederation of Gallic peoples who could coordinate their activities against common enemies while maintaining their distinct tribal identities. Shared religious practices, evidenced by similar votive deposits and sanctuary sites, helped cement these alliances and provided a framework for diplomatic cooperation. Trade relationships between the allied Gallic tribes created economic networks that strengthened their collective position in Italy. Senones' control of Adriatic ports complemented Boii agricultural production and Lingon mineral resources, creating a mutually beneficial exchange system. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased standardization of weights, measures, and coinage across Gallic territories in Italy, suggesting formal economic cooperation that went beyond simple barter relationships. The success of these tribal alliances can be measured through their collective military achievements and territorial expansion during the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC. Coordinated Gallic campaigns pushed southward along the Adriatic coast and westward into central Italy, challenging Etruscan and early Roman power in regions that had been considered secure for centuries. The famous sack of Rome in 390 BC, while primarily attributed to the Senones, likely involved warriors from multiple Gallic tribes acting in coordination under Senones' leadership. Settlement patterns established by the Senones in Italy reflected both their Gallic heritage and adaptation to Mediterranean conditions. Hilltop oppida remained important as defensive strongholds and political centres, but coastal settlements and river valley farms became equally significant components of their territorial organisation. Archaeological excavations reveal a mixed settlement strategy that combined traditional Celtic fortified sites with new types of communities designed to exploit Italian agricultural and commercial opportunities. The integration of Senones communities into Italian trade networks proceeded rapidly, with archaeological evidence showing the adoption of Mediterranean pottery styles, cooking techniques, and dietary patterns within a generation of initial settlement. However, this cultural adaptation occurred alongside the maintenance of distinctly Celtic religious practices, artistic traditions, and social structures that preserved tribal identity even as material culture evolved to match local conditions. The political landscape of central Italy in the early 4th century BC created a complex web of rivalries and shifting alliances that would ultimately draw the Senones deeper into Italian affairs than they had initially intended. The Etruscan city-state of Clusium, located in modern-day Chiusi, found itself under increasing pressure from expanding Roman influence in the region. This ancient city, which had flourished for centuries as a major centre of Etruscan power, controlled crucial trade routes between the Tyrrhenian coast and the interior valleys of central Italy. Archaeological evidence from Clusium during this period reveals extensive fortification efforts, with massive stone walls and defensive earthworks constructed to protect the city's wealth and strategic position. The Romans, having recently expelled their last king and established their republican government, pursued an aggressive expansionist policy that brought them into direct conflict with established Etruscan powers. Roman military colonies, known as coloniae, had been planted throughout Latium and were beginning to push northward into territories that the Etruscans considered their traditional sphere of influence. The Roman capture of Veii in 396 BC, after a decade-long siege, demonstrated their growing military capabilities and sent shockwaves throughout the Etruscan world. Veii's fall eliminated a major Etruscan stronghold just 12 miles from Rome and provided the Romans with vast new territories and resources to fuel further expansion. Faced with this Roman pressure, the Etruscan aristocracy of Clusium made the fateful decision to seek military assistance from the Gallic tribes that had recently established themselves along the Adriatic coast. The Senones, with their reputation for martial prowess and their strategic position in eastern Italy, appeared to offer an ideal solution to Clusium's military needs. Etruscan emissaries, carrying substantial payments of gold and silver, travelled to Senones settlements to negotiate military cooperation against their common Roman enemy. The Senones' response to these Etruscan overtures reflected both opportunism and genuine strategic calculation. Their own expansion southward along the Adriatic had brought them into contact with Roman allies and client states, creating natural friction between the two powers. The prospect of substantial Etruscan payments, combined with opportunities for plunder and territorial gain, made military intervention an attractive proposition for Senones' war leaders eager to enhance their status and wealth. Brennus, the Senones chieftain who would lead the campaign against Rome, emerges from the historical record as a figure of considerable military and political acumen. His name, derived from the Celtic word Brennus, meaning king or leader, suggests he held supreme authority among the Senones warriors who gathered for the Italian expedition. Classical sources describe him as a man of imposing physical presence, though these accounts must be viewed with caution given their Roman authorship and the tendency to exaggerate the characteristics of both enemies and heroes. The Senones force that marched toward Clusium in 390 BC represented a significant military undertaking that drew warriors from multiple settlements throughout their Italian territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that Senones' military organisation followed traditional Celtic patterns, with individual warriors responsible for providing their own weapons and equipment, while war leaders coordinated overall strategy and logistics. The army that assembled under Brennus included not only Senones warriors, but also contingents from allied Gallic tribes, creating a formidable force that may have numbered in the tens of thousands. Celtic military equipment during this period reflected centuries of evolution and adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. The characteristic Laten longsword, measuring between 60 and 80 centimetres in length, provided Gallic warriors with a devastating slashing weapon ideally suited to their traditional fighting style. These swords, forged from high-quality iron using sophisticated pattern welding techniques, could cleave through bronze armour and inflict terrible wounds on unprotected opponents. Archaeological examples recovered from warrior graves demonstrate the exceptional craftsmanship involved in their production, with complex geometric patterns created by folding and welding different grades of iron and steel. Spears formed the primary weapon for most Senones warriors, with iron-tipped ash shafts measuring 2 to 3 metres in length. These weapons served multiple functions on the battlefield, allowing warriors to engage enemies at distance before closing for hand-to-hand combat. The spear points, often elaborately decorated with bronze inlays and geometric patterns, varied in size and shape depending on their intended use. Broad-bladed spears designed for thrusting attacks featured reinforced sockets to prevent the head from breaking off during combat, while lighter javelins intended for throwing incorporated barbed points that made them difficult to remove from shields or flesh. Celtic shields, while rarely preserved due to their organic construction, can be reconstructed from archaeological finds of metal fittings and classical descriptions. These large oval or rectangular shields, measuring approximately 1 metre in height and constructed from wooden planks covered with leather, provided substantial protection against both missile weapons and hand-to-hand attacks. Bronze or iron shield bosses, often decorated with intricate Celtic artistic motifs, reinforced the centre of each shield while providing an offensive weapon for close combat. The characteristic Celtic shield grip, positioned behind the boss, allowed warriors to punch with their shields while maintaining defensive coverage. The march toward Clusium brought the Senones army through territories that had witnessed centuries of conflict between various Italian peoples. The route likely followed established roads and river valleys that provided access to water and supplies while avoiding the most difficult terrain. Classical sources suggest that the Gallic army moved with considerable speed, covering the distance from their coastal settlements to Clusium in a matter of weeks. This rapid advance prevented effective coordination among potential enemies while maintaining the element of surprise that formed a crucial component of Celtic military doctrine. The initial encounters between Senones' forces and Clusium's enemies demonstrated the effectiveness of Celtic military tactics against traditional Italian warfare methods. Gallic warriors, fighting with the fierce enthusiasm that characterized their martial culture, overwhelmed organised resistance through the sheer ferocity of their attacks. The psychological impact of Celtic war cries, combined with their imposing physical appearance and unfamiliar fighting techniques, proved devastating against opponents accustomed to more conventional forms of warfare. However, the situation at Clusium became complicated by the arrival of Roman diplomatic envoys who had been dispatched to mediate the conflict between the Etruscans and their Gallic allies. These Roman representatives, members of the prestigious Fabii family, possessed significant political authority and were tasked with preventing further Gallic expansion that might threaten Roman interests in the region. The Fabii envoys attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution that would satisfy Senones' demands while preserving Etruscan independence and Roman strategic objectives. The breakdown of these diplomatic negotiations occurred when the Roman envoys, either through miscalculation or deliberate provocation, participated in combat operations against the Senones' forces. Classical sources describe incidents in which Roman representatives took up arms alongside Etruscan defenders, violating the neutrality that their diplomatic status should have guaranteed. This breach of diplomatic protocol provided Brennus with both legal justification and political motivation for extending his campaign beyond its original objectives to include direct confrontation with Roman power. The Senones' demand for the surrender of the Fabii envoys who had violated diplomatic immunity reflected both Celtic legal traditions and practical military considerations. Celtic law, as preserved in later Irish and Welsh sources, placed enormous emphasis on the sanctity of diplomatic agreements and the punishment of those who violated them. The Roman refusal to surrender the offending envoys, combined with their decision to honour the Fabii with magistracies upon their return to Rome, demonstrated a fundamental disrespect for Celtic legal principles that could not be ignored without loss of face. The transformation of what had begun as a limited military intervention in support of Etruscan allies into a direct challenge to Roman power reflected the complex dynamics of Celtic warrior society. Individual warriors who had joined Brennus's expedition in hopes of gaining wealth and glory through successful campaigning now found themselves committed to a much larger conflict that offered both greater risks and potentially greater rewards. The prospect of sacking Rome itself, with its accumulated wealth and prestigious temples, must have seemed irresistible to warriors whose culture celebrated martial achievement above all other forms of success. The march southward from Clusium toward Rome brought the Senones army through territories that had been under Roman control or influence for generations. The speed of their advance prevented effective mobilization of Roman allies and client states, while the reputation of Celtic military prowess encouraged many communities to avoid confrontation rather than risk destruction. Archaeological evidence from this period shows signs of hasty abandonment at several sites along the likely route of advance, suggesting that civilian populations fled rather than face the approaching Gallic army. The Roman response to reports of the advancing Senones force reflected both the urgency of the situation and the limitations of early republican military organisation. The Roman army of this period relied heavily on citizen soldiers who required time to assemble, organise, and march to threatened areas. The speed of the Gallic advance compressed this timeline dramatically, forcing Roman commanders to deploy available forces without adequate preparation or coordination with potential allies. The Roman force that marched north to confront Brennus at the Allia River represented a substantial portion of the city's military strength, including both regular legions and hastily recruited auxiliaries. Archaeological evidence suggests that Roman military equipment during this period still showed significant Etruscan influence, with bronze armour and Greek-style hoplite tactics forming the backbone of their tactical system. Roman soldiers carried large round shields, bronze breastplates, and short thrusting spears that were designed for close formation fighting rather than the individual combat preferred by Celtic warriors. The Battle of the Allia, fought on July 18th, 390 BC, represented a collision between two fundamentally different military traditions that had evolved under vastly different circumstances. The Romans, trained in disciplined formation fighting and accustomed to facing similarly organised opponents, found themselves confronting an enemy whose tactics, equipment and psychological approach to warfare differed radically from anything in their previous experience. The Senones, conversely, faced opponents whose disciplined formations and coordinated tactics presented challenges that required adaptation of their traditional fighting methods. Brennus positioned his forces along the banks of the Allia River, a small tributary of the Tiber, located approximately 11 miles north of Rome. The terrain offered several tactical advantages to the Celtic commander, including elevated positions that would force the Romans to attack uphill while providing the Gallic army with clear fields of fire for their missile weapons. The river itself, while not a major obstacle, channeled the Roman approach and prevented them from fully deploying their superior numbers in the initial stages of the battle. The Celtic battle line extended across the valley floor, with the river protecting one flank and rising ground securing the other. Brennus placed his most experienced warriors in the centre, where they could provide a solid anchor for the entire formation, while demonstrating their prowess to younger fighters positioned on the flanks. The Senones chieftain himself took position with the elite warriors in the front rank, following Celtic tradition that required leaders to share the dangers faced by their followers. The Roman tactical deployment reflected their confidence in traditional formation fighting and their underestimation of Celtic military capabilities. Roman commanders positioned their heavy infantry in the centre with lighter troops and allied contingents, extending the line toward both flanks. This conventional approach, while effective against similarly organised opponents, failed to account for the mobility and individual fighting skills that characterise Celtic warfare. The initial Celtic assault shattered Roman expectations and tactical assumptions within moments of contact between the two armies. Senones warriors, screaming their traditional war cries and brandishing their longswords above their heads, charged down the slope toward the Roman formation with a ferocity that stunned their opponents. The psychological impact of this assault, combined with the unfamiliar sight of half-naked warriors decorated with war paint and torques, proved devastating to Roman morale even before physical combat commenced. Celtic fighting techniques, developed through centuries of intertribal warfare and individual combat, proved devastatingly effective against Roman formation tactics. Senones warriors used their superior reach and mobility to break through Roman shield walls, employing their long swords to strike over and around the smaller Roman shields. The Celtic emphasis on individual prowess allowed experienced warriors to exploit gaps in the Roman line, creating opportunities for their comrades to pour through and attack the Romans from multiple directions simultaneously. The collapse of Roman resistance at the Allia occurred with shocking rapidity, transforming what should have been a hard-fought battle into a complete rout within hours of the initial contact. Roman soldiers, trained to fight in close formation with mutual support from their comrades, found themselves isolated and vulnerable once their tactical cohesion broke down. the speed and violence of the Celtic assault prevented effective rallying or organised retreat, leaving individual Romans to flee as best they could toward the illusory safety of their city. The devastating victory at the Allia River opened the road to Rome for Brennus and his Senones warriors, but the immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the complex challenges that awaited the Gallic forces as they attempted to consolidate their stunning military success into lasting territorial gains. The Roman survivors who fled southward carried with them not only news of the catastrophic defeat, but also detailed intelligence about Celtic military capabilities, tactical preferences, and organisational weaknesses that would prove invaluable for future Roman planning. Meanwhile, the Senones found themselves in possession of a strategic corridor leading directly to the heart of Roman power, yet lacking the siege equipment, logistical infrastructure, and administrative experience necessary to capitalise fully on their battlefield triumph. The 3-day delay between the Battle of the Allia and the actual assault on Rome reflected careful deliberation on the part of Brennus and his war council rather than hesitation or tactical confusion. Celtic military tradition emphasised the importance of proper ritual preparation before major undertakings, and the prospect of attacking one of Italy's most significant urban centres required extensive consultation with druids and divination specialists who accompanied the army. Archaeological evidence from Celtic religious sites suggests that such consultations involved complex ceremonies, including animal sacrifice, examination of entrails, and interpretation of natural omens that could influence strategic decision-making. During this crucial interval, Roman defenders frantically prepared their city's defences while debating whether to attempt a negotiated settlement or resist to the bitter end. The ancient sources describe chaotic scenes within Rome as civilians fled to the countryside, valuable objects were buried or hidden, and the remaining military forces took defensive positions on the Capitoline Hill. The decision to abandon the lower city while concentrating resistance on the Capitoline reflected both the practical limitations of Roman defensive capabilities and a calculated gamble that the Gallic forces would eventually withdraw if denied easy plunder and decisive victory. The Senones' assault on Rome, when it finally came, demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Celtic urban warfare capabilities. Gallic warriors, accustomed to fighting in open terrain or attacking hilltop oppida, found themselves confronting defensive challenges that differed significantly from their previous military experience. Roman urban architecture, with its narrow streets, multi-storey buildings, and complex defensive positions, required tactical adaptations that tested the flexibility of Celtic military organisation. The absence of sophisticated siege equipment forced the Senones to rely primarily on direct assault tactics that proved costly when applied to well-defended urban positions. The initial penetration of Rome's outer defences occurred through a combination of Celtic audacity and Roman defensive failures, rather than superior Gallic siegecraft. Senones warriors scaled city walls using improvised ladders and grappling hooks, while others forced their way through gates that had been inadequately secured or abandoned by fleeing defenders. The speed of the Celtic advance through the lower city reflected their experience in rapid assault tactics, but also revealed the limited nature of Roman resistance once their primary field army had been destroyed at the Allia. The 7-month siege of the Capitoline Hill that followed the capture of Lower Rome transformed the conflict from a swift military campaign into a prolonged test of endurance that challenged both Celtic and Roman capabilities in unexpected ways. The Senones, having achieved their immediate military objectives, found themselves committed to a static siege operation that contradicted their traditional preferences for mobile warfare and rapid resolution of conflicts. The need to maintain a blockade around the Capitoline while securing their own supply lines and defending against potential relief efforts required organisational skills and logistical planning that stretched Celtic military capabilities to their limits. Roman resistance on the Capitoline demonstrated remarkable tenacity, despite the desperate nature of their situation. The hill's natural defensive advantages, including steep approaches and limited access routes, allowed a relatively small garrison to hold out against vastly superior numbers. Archaeological excavations on the Capitoline have revealed evidence of extensive defensive preparations dating to this period, including reinforced walls, storage facilities, and water systems that enabled prolonged resistance. The presence of Rome's most sacred temples on the Capitoline added religious motivation to the practical necessities of defence, creating a psychological framework that sustained Roman morale throughout the siege. The negotiated settlement that eventually ended the siege reflected mutual exhaustion and practical necessity rather than decisive military victory for either side. The famous ransom of £1,000 of gold, while representing a substantial payment that demonstrated Roman desperation, also acknowledged Celtic willingness to accept compensation rather than pursue complete destruction of their enemies. The incident of the false weights, whether historical fact or later Roman propaganda, symbolised the complex mixture of respect and resentment that would characterise Romano-Celtic relations for centuries to come. The withdrawal of Brennus and his forces from Rome marked the beginning of a new phase in Senones history, as they turned their attention toward establishing permanent territorial control in the regions they had conquered. The wealth gained from the Roman ransom, combined with plunder accumulated during their Italian campaigns, provided resources necessary for the systematic development of their Adriatic territories. Archaeological evidence from Senones sites dating to the period immediately following the sack of Rome shows dramatic increases in construction activity, craft production, and trade relationships that reflect their enhanced status and financial capabilities. The establishment of Sena Gallica as the primary urban centre and tribal capital represented a fundamental shift in Senones settlement patterns and political organisation. Located near the mouth of the Misa River on the Adriatic coast, the site offered exceptional advantages for both maritime commerce and territorial administration. The natural harbour provided secure anchorage for trading vessels, while the river valley offered access to the rich agricultural hinterland of the Apennine foothills. Archaeological excavations at Senigallia, the modern successor to Sena Gallica, have revealed extensive remains of Celtic settlement layers that demonstrate sophisticated urban planning and substantial investment in permanent infrastructure. The urban layout of Sena Gallica reflected a synthesis of Celtic architectural traditions and Mediterranean urban planning concepts that the Senones had encountered through their interactions with Greek colonies and Etruscan cities. The settlement featured a central area containing public buildings, religious structures, and elite residences arranged around open spaces that served as markets and assembly areas. This core was surrounded by residential districts organised along a grid pattern that facilitated efficient movement and administration, while providing adequate space for craft workshops and storage facilities. The construction techniques employed at Sena Gallica demonstrated remarkable adaptation to local conditions and available materials. Celtic builders, traditionally accustomed to working with timber and earth, incorporated stonemasonry and tile roofing that proved better suited to Mediterranean climate conditions. The use of local limestone and clay allowed for more durable construction, while reducing transportation costs and construction time. Archaeological analysis of building foundations reveals sophisticated engineering, including drainage systems, foundation reinforcement, and fire-resistant construction techniques that reflected learning from both Celtic traditions and Italian innovations. The fortification system surrounding Sena Gallica combined Celtic defensive concepts with tactical lessons learned from their Italian campaigns. The main defensive wall, constructed using a timber frame technique known as murus gallicis, incorporated stone facing and internal timber bracing that provided exceptional strength against both direct assault and siege equipment. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of multiple construction phases that suggest continuous improvement and expansion of the defensive system as the settlement grew in size and strategic importance. The harbour facilities at Sena Gallica represented one of the most sophisticated engineering projects undertaken by the Senones during the Italian period. The construction of stone quays, warehouses and shipbuilding facilities required substantial investment and technical expertise that demonstrated the tribe's commitment to maritime commerce. Archaeological evidence includes remains of stone anchors, ship fittings, and warehouse foundations that indicate extensive trading activity with Greek colonies in southern Italy, Sicily, and the eastern Mediterranean. The agricultural development of the territory surrounding Sena Gallica reflected systematic efforts to maximize the productive potential of their newly acquired lands. The fertile alluvial soils of the coastal plain proved ideally suited to Mediterranean crops, including wheat, barley, olives, and grapes that provided both subsistence and trade commodities. Archaeological survey work has identified numerous rural settlements and farmsteads that demonstrate planned colonization of agricultural areas using techniques that combined Celtic farming traditions with locally adapted methods. The introduction of olive cultivation represented a particularly significant innovation that required substantial initial investment and long-term planning. Olive trees, while extremely productive once established, require several years to reach maturity and generate meaningful harvests. The Senones' commitment to olive cultivation demonstrated their intention to remain permanently in Italy while adapting their agricultural practices to Mediterranean conditions. Archaeological evidence includes olive pressing facilities and storage jars that indicate substantial olive oil production for both local consumption and export trade. Viticulture development followed similar patterns, with the Senones adapting their traditional brewing techniques to wine production while learning Mediterranean viticultural practices from neighbouring Italian peoples. The hills surrounding Sena Gallica provided ideal conditions for grape cultivation with well-drained soils and favourable microclimates that produced high-quality wines. Archaeological excavations have revealed wine storage facilities, pressing equipment, and decorated pottery vessels specifically designed for wine consumption that demonstrate the rapid adoption of Mediterranean drinking customs. The establishment of extensive trade networks connecting Sena Gallica to markets throughout the Mediterranean world represented one of the most remarkable achievements of Senones' territorial consolidation. Their strategic position on the Adriatic coast provided access to established Greek trading routes, while their control of river valleys allowed penetration into the Italian interior. Archaeological evidence demonstrates trading relationships extending from the Black Sea colonies of Greek merchants to the western Mediterranean settlements of Massalia and beyond. The development of standardized weights, measures, and coinage facilitated these expanded trade relationships, while demonstrating sophisticated understanding of commercial practices. Senones coins from this period show clear Greek influence in their design and metallurgy, while incorporating Celtic artistic motifs and symbols that proclaim tribal identity. The use of high-quality silver and careful attention to weight standards indicate professional minting operations that met Mediterranean commercial requirements while serving domestic economic needs. The military organisation that protected these expanding territories reflected lessons learned from their Italian campaigns while maintaining core Celtic warrior traditions. The Senones developed a more sophisticated command structure that could coordinate defensive operations across multiple settlements while maintaining the mobility and individual fighting skills that had made them formidable opponents. Archaeological evidence includes standardized weapons and equipment that suggest centralized production and distribution systems designed to equip larger military forces. The fortification of key strategic positions throughout Senones' territory created a defensive network that could protect agricultural areas, trade routes, and population centres against potential enemies. These fortifications, typically located on hilltops overlooking river valleys or coastal approaches, incorporated both Celtic architectural traditions and tactical innovations learned from encounters with Roman and Etruscan military engineering. The use of natural defensive features combined with sophisticated artificial obstacles created defensive positions that could be held by relatively small garrisons while providing bases for mobile operations. The cultural synthesis that emerged within Senones territories during this period of consolidation represented a remarkable blending of Celtic, Greek, and Italian influences that created distinctive new forms of artistic expression and social organisation. Senones craftsmen incorporated Mediterranean decorative techniques into traditional Celtic metalwork, producing jewellery, weapons, and ceremonial objects that combined the flowing curvilinear patterns of Latini art with geometric motifs derived from Greek and Etruscan sources. This cultural fusion reflected not merely superficial borrowing, but genuine integration of different artistic traditions into coherent new styles. Religious practices evolved similarly, with Celtic druids adapting their ceremonies to include Mediterranean deities and ritual practices, while maintaining core elements of traditional Celtic spirituality. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites includes votive offerings that demonstrate this religious synthesis, with traditional Celtic torques and weapons deposited alongside Greek pottery and Italian bronze work. The construction of stone temples represented a significant departure from traditional Celtic wooden sacred structures, while incorporating architectural elements that reflected both Mediterranean and Celtic religious requirements. The consolidation of Senones' power along the Adriatic coast inevitably brought them into renewed conflict with Roman territorial ambitions as the Republic recovered from the humiliation of 390 BC and began its systematic expansion throughout the Italian peninsula. The Romans, having learned harsh lessons from their defeat at the Allia River, undertook comprehensive military reforms that transformed their legionary system into a more flexible and effective fighting force. The Manipular legion that emerged from these reforms abandoned the rigid phalanx formation that had proven so vulnerable to Celtic assault tactics, replacing it with smaller tactical units called maniples that could adapt to varied terrain and enemy fighting styles, while maintaining overall battlefield coordination. Roman military equipment underwent equally significant modifications designed specifically to counter Celtic advantages in individual combat. The traditional large round shield gave way to the scutum, a rectangular shield measuring approximately 1.2 metres in height and constructed from laminated wood strips covered with canvas and leather. This new shield design provided better protection against the downward slashing attacks favoured by Celtic longswords, while its curved shape deflected blows more effectively than flat surfaces. The iron boss and reinforced rim could serve as offensive weapons in close combat, allowing Roman soldiers to punch and edge-strike their opponents while maintaining defensive coverage. The gladius, a short-thrusting sword measuring approximately 60 centimetres in length, represented the most significant innovation in Roman weaponry during this period. This weapon, possibly derived from Spanish sword designs encountered during early Roman campaigns in Iberia, proved devastatingly effective against Celtic fighting techniques that emphasised slashing attacks with longer weapons. The gladius excelled in the close-quarters combat that characterised manipular tactics, allowing Roman soldiers to deliver fatal thrusting attacks while their opponents struggled to employ their longer swords effectively in confined spaces. Roman tactical doctrine evolved to exploit these equipment advantages through coordinated, small unit operations that negated traditional Celtic strengths in individual combat and psychological warfare. Maniples operated as semi-independent tactical units capable of mutual support while maintaining sufficient flexibility to respond to local battlefield conditions. This system allowed Roman commanders to concentrate force at decisive points while maintaining overall formation integrity, preventing the kind of catastrophic collapse that had occurred at the Allia River. The Senones, observing these Roman innovations through intelligence gathered during border skirmishes and diplomatic contacts, undertook their own military adaptations to counter evolving Roman capabilities. Celtic smiths began producing shorter, more manoeuvrable weapons suitable for closer combat, while maintaining the superior metallurgical techniques that gave their blades advantages in sharpness and durability. Archaeological evidence from Senones weapon deposits dating to this period reveals experimentation with different sword lengths, blade profiles, and hilt designs that suggest systematic efforts to optimize Celtic weapons for changing battlefield conditions. Senones' shield construction incorporated lessons learned from encounters with Roman missile weapons, particularly the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to penetrate armour and disable enemy shields. Celtic armourers developed reinforced shield construction, using metal strips and thicker leather covering that could better resist Roman javelin attacks, while maintaining the mobility advantages that characterised traditional Celtic fighting styles. The adoption of metal shield rims and reinforced bosses provided additional protection, while creating more effective offensive weapons for close combat. The development of Senones' cavalry capabilities represented perhaps their most significant military innovation during this period of conflict with Rome. Traditional Celtic warfare had emphasised infantry combat with limited use of mounted warriors except for reconnaissance and pursuit operations. However, the open terrain of central Italy and the need to counter Roman tactical mobility encouraged greater investment in cavalry forces that could exploit the speed and shock value of mounted combat. Archaeological evidence from horse burials and equestrian equipment demonstrates substantial improvements in Celtic horsemanship and mounted warfare techniques. Celtic cavalry equipment evolved to include longer spears specifically designed for mounted combat, with reinforced sockets and counterweights that provided better balance and penetrating power when delivered from horseback. The development of specialised cavalry shields, smaller and lighter than infantry versions, but still capable of deflecting enemy weapons, allowed mounted warriors to maintain defensive capability while retaining the mobility essential for effective cavalry operations. Horse breeding programs focused on developing larger, stronger animals capable of carrying armoured warriors while maintaining the speed and endurance necessary for extended campaign operations. The first major test of these evolved military systems occurred during the Roman campaign against the Aequi in 388 BC, when Senones forces intervened to support their traditional allies against Roman expansion. This conflict, while smaller in scale than the dramatic events surrounding the sack of Rome, provided crucial experience in the new tactical realities that would dominate Romano-Celtic warfare for the following century. Roman forces, employing their reformed manipular tactics, initially achieved significant success against Aequi resistance, but found themselves facing unexpected challenges when Senones' reinforcements arrived on the battlefield. The Battle of Mount Algidus demonstrated the effectiveness of combined Senones Aequi operations against Roman tactical innovations. Celtic cavalry, operating in coordination with Aequi infantry familiar with local terrain, repeatedly disrupted Roman formation movements while avoiding decisive engagement that might favour Roman tactical advantages. This hit-and-run strategy, combined with the psychological impact of Celtic war cries and aggressive individual combat techniques, prevented Roman commanders from fully exploiting their tactical reforms and ultimately forced their withdrawal from Aequi territory. The success of this defensive campaign encouraged the formation of a broader anti-Roman coalition that included not only the Senones and their immediate Gallic allies, but also various Italic peoples who felt threatened by expanding Roman power. The Volsci, Hudnici, and remnants of the Aequi joined with Gallic tribes in a loose confederation designed to coordinate resistance against Roman territorial expansion while preserving the independence of member peoples. Archaeological evidence suggests extensive communication and coordination between these allied groups, with standardized weapons, shared tactical techniques, and coordinated timing of military operations indicating sophisticated strategic planning. The Roman response to this coalition building involved both military pressure and diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate the Senones from their allies while preventing the formation of larger anti-Roman confederations. Roman diplomats, learning from their earlier mistakes in dealing with Celtic peoples, adopted more sophisticated approaches that recognized Celtic legal traditions and political structures while pursuing Roman strategic objectives. These diplomatic efforts achieved some success in detaching individual Italic peoples from the anti-Roman coalition, but failed to address the fundamental territorial conflicts that drove Senones' opposition to Roman expansion. The siege of Sutrium in 386 BC marked a significant escalation in Romano-Celtic conflict, as Senones' forces, operating in alliance with Etruscan cities threatened by Roman expansion, attempted to capture this crucial Roman stronghold that controlled access to Etruscan territories. Sutrium's strategic position at the junction of major road networks made it essential for Roman communications with their northern territories, while its capture would provide the anti-Roman coalition with a secure base for further operations against Roman interests. The siege demonstrated evolving Senones' capabilities in sustained military operations, while revealing continuing limitations in siege warfare techniques. Celtic siege tactics at Sutrium reflected adaptation of traditional assault methods to the challenges of attacking fortified positions defended by disciplined Roman garrisons. Senones' engineers constructed siege mounds and assault ramps using techniques learned from observation of Etruscan and Greek siege operations, while maintaining the aggressive direct assault tactics that characterized Celtic military tradition. The use of fire arrows, siege ladders, and coordinated infantry assaults demonstrated tactical sophistication that went beyond simple reliance on individual warrior prowess. The Roman relief of Sutrium, led by Marcus Furius Camillus, provided the first major test of reformed Roman military capabilities against evolved Senones' tactical systems. Camillus, having observed Celtic fighting methods during the earlier siege of Veii, employed tactical innovations specifically designed to counter Celtic advantages while exploiting Roman strengths in discipline and coordination. The resulting battle demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman military reforms, while revealing areas where further adaptation would be necessary to achieve decisive superiority over Celtic opponents. The tactical engagement outside Sutrium's walls showcased the evolution of both military systems since their previous major encounter. Roman maniples, operating with improved coordination and mutual support, proved more resilient against Celtic assault tactics, while maintaining sufficient flexibility to respond to changing battlefield conditions. However, Senones' forces demonstrated their own tactical evolution through improved coordination between infantry and cavalry units, more sophisticated use of terrain features, and better integration of allied Etruscan forces into their overall battle plan. The inconclusive nature of the Sutrium campaign reflected the broader strategic stalemate that characterized Romano-Celtic relations during this period. Neither side possessed decisive advantages sufficient to achieve complete victory, while both had developed military capabilities that prevented catastrophic defeat of the kind that had occurred at the Allia River. This tactical balance encouraged the development of more sophisticated strategic approaches that emphasized economic warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, and territorial control, rather than simple battlefield confrontation. Senones' raiding operations throughout the 380 S and 370 S BC represented a systematic campaign designed to weaken Roman economic capabilities, while avoiding the kind of decisive battles that might favour Roman tactical advantages. These raids, typically involving relatively small forces of mounted warriors supported by local allies, targeted Roman agricultural areas, trade routes, and isolated settlements that could not be effectively defended by concentrated Roman forces. The economic damage inflicted by these operations, while individually limited, accumulated over time to create significant strain on Roman resources and civilian morale. The targeting of Roman colonies represented a particularly effective aspect of Senones' raiding strategy, as these settlements served both as symbols of Roman expansion and as practical bases for further territorial control. Attacks on colonies such as Nepet and Falaise demonstrated Celtic capabilities for coordinated operations against fortified positions, while sending clear messages about the costs of Roman territorial ambitions. The psychological impact of these raids often exceeded their immediate military significance, encouraging anti-Roman sentiment among Italic peoples while demonstrating the limitations of Roman protective capabilities. Roman counter-raiding operations attempted to impose similar economic costs on Senones territories, while demonstrating Roman military capabilities to potential allies and enemies. These campaigns, typically conducted during agricultural seasons, when Celtic warriors might be occupied with farming activities, targeted Senones coastal settlements, trade facilities, and agricultural areas that supported their military capabilities. The limited success of these operations reflected both the defensive advantages of Senones coastal positions and the tactical challenges faced by Roman forces operating in unfamiliar territory against opponents who retained significant mobility advantages. The development of fortified road networks represented a Roman innovation designed to project power into contested territories while providing secure communications between Roman bases and Allied settlements. These roads, protected by regularly spaced fortifications and patrolled by mobile forces, allowed Roman armies to move rapidly between threatened areas while maintaining supply lines essential for sustained operations. The construction of such infrastructure required substantial investment of resources and manpower, but provided long-term strategic advantages that gradually shifted the balance of territorial control in Rome's favour. Senones' responses to Roman road-building efforts included systematic attacks on construction sites, ambushes of Roman engineering units, and attempts to destroy completed sections through coordinated raiding operations. These defensive measures, while individually successful in delaying Roman construction projects, ultimately proved insufficient to prevent the gradual extension of Roman infrastructure into territories previously considered secure Celtic domains. The strategic implications of this infrastructure development would become increasingly apparent as Roman capabilities for rapid deployment and sustained operations continued to improve throughout the following decades. The strategic stalemate that had characterized Romano-Celtic relations throughout the 370s and 360s BC began to shift decisively in Rome's favour during the following decades as accumulated Roman advantages in infrastructure, military organisation, and diplomatic alliances reached critical mass. The systematic construction of fortified roads, establishment of military colonies, and cultivation of anti-Celtic sentiment among Italic peoples created an increasingly constrictive environment around Senones territories that limited their strategic options while enhancing Roman capabilities for sustained military operations. By the 290 SBC, the Senones found themselves facing not merely Roman territorial ambitions, but a comprehensive strategic encirclement that threatened their fundamental survival as an independent power in Italy. The Roman conquest of Samnium between 343 and 290 BC provided crucial strategic advantages that directly impacted the balance of power along the Adriatic coast. Roman control of the central Apennine passes eliminated traditional Senones escape routes toward their Gallic homeland, while providing Roman forces with secure bases for operations against Celtic territories. The veteran legions that emerged from decades of Samnite warfare possessed unparalleled experience in mountain combat, siege operations, and sustained campaigning that made them formidable opponents for any Celtic force. Archaeological evidence from former Samnite strongholds reveals extensive Roman fortification efforts designed to create permanent bases for further expansion rather than temporary occupation forces. The establishment of Roman naval capabilities in the Adriatic fundamentally altered the strategic equation for Senones coastal settlements that had previously relied on maritime escape routes and supply lines. Roman construction of naval bases at Brundisium and Ancona provided platforms for systematic interdiction of Celtic maritime communications, while threatening direct assault on previously secure coastal positions. The Roman fleet, while initially modest compared to later imperial standards, possessed sufficient strength to challenge Celtic control of Adriatic trade routes that formed the economic foundation of Senones' power in Italy. Senones' diplomatic efforts to secure external support against mounting Roman pressure achieved limited success as potential allies faced their own Roman military pressure, or calculated that accommodation with Roman power offered better prospects than continued resistance. The Boii, traditional allies who controlled territories in the western Po Valley, found themselves increasingly isolated by Roman diplomatic initiatives that detached individual Celtic settlements through offers of favourable terms for submission. Archaeological evidence from Boii sites during this period shows signs of internal conflict and population movement that suggest political fragmentation under Roman pressure. The failure of broader Gallic intervention on behalf of their Italian kinsmen reflected both the practical difficulties of organising large-scale military operations across the Alps and the growing strength of Roman defensive preparations along traditional invasion routes. Transalpine Celtic peoples, while maintaining cultural and family connections with Italian Gallic tribes, faced their own territorial pressures from Germanic expansion and internal political conflicts that limited their ability to provide meaningful military assistance. The few Gallic reinforcements that did reach Italy during this period proved insufficient to alter the fundamental strategic balance, while often arriving too late to participate effectively in critical military operations. Roman psychological warfare operations systematically undermined Senones' morale and political cohesion through targeted propaganda campaigns that emphasized the futility of continued resistance while offering attractive terms for individual defection. Roman agents, operating through established trade networks and diplomatic contacts, spread accounts of Celtic defeats in other theatres, while highlighting Roman clemency toward former enemies who submitted voluntarily. These operations, combined with visible Roman military preparations and the gradual isolation of Senones' territories, created internal pressures that weakened Celtic resolve and encouraged factional disputes within tribal leadership. The economic warfare that accompanied military pressure proved equally devastating to Senones' capabilities as Roman control of trade routes and systematic targeting of commercial infrastructure gradually strangled the economic foundations of Celtic power. Roman interdiction of maritime commerce eliminated crucial revenue sources, while attacks on agricultural areas reduced the food supplies necessary to sustain large military forces. The cumulative effect of these economic pressures forced difficult choices between maintaining military capabilities and preserving civilian populations that ultimately weakened both Celtic defensive preparations and popular support for continued resistance. The political crisis that erupted within Senones' leadership during the early 280 SBC reflected these accumulated pressures, as different factions advocated competing strategies for dealing with the Roman threat. Archaeological evidence from Sena Gallica during this period reveals signs of hasty construction and defensive preparations that suggest urgent military concerns, while coin hoards buried throughout Senones' territories indicate widespread civilian anxiety about future security. The discovery of weapons caches hidden in rural settlements demonstrates systematic preparation for guerrilla warfare that suggests recognition of the likelihood of conventional military defeat. The Roman decision to launch a decisive campaign against the Senones in 283 BC reflected careful calculation that the strategic moment had arrived for final resolution of the Celtic threat to Roman expansion along the Adriatic coast. Consul Publius Cornelius Dolabella, appointed to command the expedition, possessed extensive experience in Celtic warfare gained during previous campaigns against Gallic tribes in northern Italy. His selection for this crucial command demonstrated Roman confidence in their military capabilities, while acknowledging the serious nature of the challenge posed by Senones' resistance. Dolabella's strategic planning emphasized coordination between multiple Roman forces operating from different directions to prevent Senones' concentration of defensive efforts, while eliminating potential escape routes that might allow Celtic forces to withdraw and regroup. Roman forces advancing from the south along the coastal route would coordinate with mountain columns, descending from Apennine passes to create a systematic compression of Celtic territories that would force decisive engagement under conditions favourable to Roman tactical advantages. This multi-directional approach reflected sophisticated strategic thinking that had evolved through decades of experience in Italian warfare. The Roman army that assembled for the final campaign against the Senones represented the culmination of military reforms and tactical innovations developed through generations of Italian warfare. The legions that marched north under Dolabella's command included veteran units with extensive experience against Celtic opponents, supplemented by allied contingents from recently conquered territories who possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and Celtic fighting methods. Archaeological analysis of Roman military equipment from this period reveals standardized production techniques and improved metallurgy that gave Roman soldiers significant advantages in weapons quality and protective equipment. The siege train that accompanied Dolabella's forces included sophisticated engineering equipment specifically designed for operations against Celtic fortifications. Roman engineers had studied Celtic defensive techniques through decades of siege operations, developing specialized equipment and tactics for breaching the timber-framed walls that characterized Gallic fortifications. The presence of artillery engines, siege towers, and mining equipment demonstrated Roman commitment to achieving decisive results rather than accepting another inconclusive campaign that might allow Celtic recovery and renewed resistance. The initial Roman advance into Senones territory proceeded with methodical precision that reflected careful reconnaissance and strategic planning. Roman forces systematically occupied key terrain features while establishing fortified bases that could support extended operations and prevent Celtic counterattacks against Roman supply lines. The speed of this advance, achieved through superior logistics and coordinated movement, prevented effective Senones mobilization, while demonstrating Roman military capabilities to potential Celtic allies who might otherwise have provided assistance. Celtic defensive preparations revealed both the sophistication of Senones' military planning and the limitations imposed by their strategic situation. Archaeological evidence from hastily constructed fortifications demonstrates desperate efforts to create defensive positions capable of withstanding Roman assault while providing bases for mobile operations against Roman supply lines. However, the scattered nature of these defensive works and their obvious construction under time pressure indicated the fundamental weakness of the Celtic position, as Roman forces achieved tactical surprise and strategic initiative. The first major engagement between Roman and Celtic forces occurred near the Metaurus River, where Senones' warriors attempted to halt Roman advance through coordinated attacks on Roman column formations. Celtic tactical planning emphasized traditional strengths in individual combat and psychological warfare, with mass charges designed to break Roman formation discipline through sheer ferocity and superior individual fighting skills. However, Roman tactical responses demonstrated the effectiveness of their military reforms, as manipular formations maintained cohesion under Celtic assault while delivering coordinated counterattacks that exploited gaps in Celtic coordination. The battle itself unfolded with devastating efficiency, as Roman tactical advantages proved decisive against Celtic fighting methods that had not adapted sufficiently to counter-evolved Roman capabilities. Celtic long swords, while individually superior weapons, proved less effective against Roman close formation tactics that emphasized coordinated thrusting attacks with shorter weapons designed for confined combat. Roman shield walls absorbed Celtic assault momentum, while creating opportunities for systematic elimination of individual Celtic warriors who found themselves isolated once their initial charge lost momentum. Roman cavalry operations during the battle demonstrated sophisticated coordination between mounted and infantry forces that prevented Celtic attempts to outflank Roman formations while maintaining pressure on Celtic withdrawal routes. The Roman equites, while less individually skilled than Celtic cavalry, operated with disciplined coordination that allowed them to achieve local superiority through concentrated attacks on isolated Celtic units. This tactical coordination, combined with superior Roman logistics that ensured fresh mounts and adequate supplies, gradually wore down Celtic resistance through sustained pressure rather than decisive single engagements. The collapse of organised Senones resistance at the Metaurus opened their coastal territories to systematic Roman occupation as Celtic survivors fled toward their remaining strongholds or attempted to escape across the Adriatic to potential safety in Illyrian territories. Roman pursuit operations, conducted with methodical thoroughness, prevented effective Celtic regrouping while capturing substantial numbers of prisoners who would later face enslavement or execution. The speed and completeness of this Roman victory eliminated any possibility of Celtic recovery while demonstrating to remaining opponents the futility of continued resistance. The siege of Sena Gallica represented the final act of organised Senones resistance as the remaining Celtic population concentrated in their principal stronghold for a desperate last stand against overwhelming Roman forces. The city's fortifications, strengthened through decades of construction and improvement, provided formidable defensive advantages that required systematic Roman siege operations to overcome. Archaeological evidence from the siege layers reveals extensive Roman engineering works, including circumvallation walls, siege mounds, and artillery positions that demonstrate the professional competence of Roman military engineering. Celtic defensive efforts during the siege revealed both desperate courage and tactical sophistication, as Senones warriors employed every available method to resist Roman assault operations. Our archaeological finds include evidence of countermining operations, sally ports for surprise attacks on Roman siege works, and improvised defensive weapons created from available materials. However, the overwhelming Roman advantages in manpower, equipment, and logistics made the outcome inevitable despite fierce Celtic resistance that prolonged the siege for several months. The final assault on Sena Gallica combined coordinated attacks from multiple directions with systematic destruction of Celtic defensive works through Roman engineering capabilities. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive fire damage and deliberate destruction that indicates Roman determination to eliminate the city as a potential future base for Celtic resistance. The thoroughness of this destruction, combined with the systematic looting that followed Roman victory, demonstrated Roman intent to make Celtic recovery impossible, while providing tangible rewards for the Roman soldiers who had endured the hardships of extended campaigning. The aftermath of Sena Gallica's fall witnessed systematic Roman elimination of Senones political and military leadership through execution or enslavement that effectively decapitated Celtic resistance capabilities. Roman forces conducted methodical searches for hidden weapons, treasure, and surviving Celtic nobles who might serve as focal points for future resistance movements. The completeness of these operations, documented through archaeological evidence of hidden caches that were never recovered, indicates the thoroughness of Roman security measures designed to prevent any possibility of Celtic resurgence. The systematic destruction of Senones' power in their Italian territories did not mark the complete disappearance of Celtic presence from the Italian peninsula, as scattered communities and individual survivors managed to escape Roman retribution through flight to mountainous regions or assimilation into existing populations. However, the fate that awaited the Senones communities that had remained in their ancestral Gallic territories along the Seine and Yonne rivers proved equally challenging, though through different mechanisms of pressure and transformation. These communities, while geographically removed from the immediate devastation that befell their Italian kinsmen, found themselves increasingly caught between the expanding influence of Roman power from the south and the growing pressure of Germanic tribes pushing westward across the Rhine. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the traditional Senones heartland reveals significant changes in settlement patterns and material culture during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC that reflect these mounting external pressures. Excavations at Sens, the ancient Agadincum, show clear stratification layers indicating periods of abandonment and reoccupation that suggest population instability during this crucial period. Storage pit complexes, previously used for grain preservation, show evidence of hasty filling with personal possessions and valuable objects that indicate emergency evacuations. The discovery of weapon hoards buried in rural locations throughout the Yonne Valley demonstrates systematic preparation for conflict while revealing the sophisticated metallurgical capabilities that Senones smiths maintained despite political disruption. The material culture recovered from these disturbed archaeological contexts demonstrates continuing Celtic artistic traditions, while showing increasing influence from both Roman and Germanic sources. Latin metalwork from this period exhibits technical refinements that suggest ongoing craft specialization despite political upheaval, with bronze torques and iron weapons displaying the characteristic flowing curvilinear designs that defined Celtic artistic expression. However, pottery assemblages reveal growing standardization that may indicate either increased trade relationships or gradual cultural homogenization under external pressure. Imported Roman amphorae appear with increasing frequency in elite contexts, suggesting diplomatic or commercial relationships that provided access to Mediterranean luxury goods. The political organization of remaining Senones communities underwent significant transformation as traditional tribal structures adapted to new strategic realities. The decentralized authority that had characterized earlier Senones society gradually gave way to more centralized leadership capable of coordinating defensive efforts across multiple settlements. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of fortified central places that served as refuges and administrative centers during periods of crisis. These oppida, typically located on defensible hilltops with commanding views of river valleys, incorporated sophisticated defensive earthworks and timber palisades that required coordinated labor efforts from multiple communities. The construction techniques employed in these defensive works reveal adaptation of traditional Celtic fortification methods to counter evolving military threats. The characteristic Murus Gallicus construction, utilizing timber framework filled with stone and earth, underwent modifications that incorporated lessons learned from reports of Roman siege capabilities. Archaeological analysis reveals increased use of iron nails and metal reinforcements in timber construction, while defensive ditches show evidence of multiple construction phases that suggest ongoing improvement and expansion of defensive capabilities. Religious practices within these threatened communities intensified as Senones druids sought divine protection against mounting external pressures while maintaining cultural traditions that defined tribal identity. Sacred groves and spring sanctuaries throughout the region show evidence of increased votive activity during this period, with deposits of weapons, jewelry, and precious metals indicating desperate appeals for divine intervention. The construction of new sacred enclosures, typically featuring circular timber structures surrounded by ritual ditches, demonstrates continuing investment in religious infrastructure despite military threats and economic disruption. The Druids themselves faced particular challenges as Roman expansion brought systematic persecution of Celtic religious leadership that Romans viewed as obstacles to pacification and cultural assimilation. Classical sources document Roman efforts to eliminate Druidical influence through targeted assassination and legal prohibition of traditional religious practices. Archaeological evidence suggests that Druids adapted to these pressures through increased secrecy and dispersion of the religious activities across multiple hidden locations, rather than traditional centralized sacred sites that might attract Roman attention. Economic disruption accompanied political fragmentation, as traditional trade networks faced increasing interference from both Roman territorial expansion and Germanic tribal movements. The Senones had long served as intermediaries in commercial relationships connecting Atlantic coastal regions with Mediterranean markets through river valley routes that provided efficient transportation for bulk commodities. Roman control of southern Gaul gradually eliminated direct access to Mediterranean markets, while Germanic pressure from the east threatened established relationships with Central European trading partners. Archaeological evidence from trading centres throughout Senones territory reveals dramatic changes in commercial activity during the 2nd century BC. Coin hoards from this period show increasing proportions of foreign currency alongside traditional Celtic issues, suggesting disruption of established monetary systems and growing reliance on external economic relationships. Workshop sites show evidence of production changes that emphasize portable, valuable goods rather than bulk commodities, indicating adaptation to uncertain transportation conditions and volatile market access. The development of new trade relationships with emerging Germanic confederations provided some compensation for lost Mediterranean connections, while creating dependencies that would prove problematic as Germanic pressure continued to intensify. Archaeological assemblages from border regions show increasing presence of Germanic material culture alongside traditional Celtic artifacts, suggesting either peaceful commercial exchange or gradual population infiltration that would eventually threaten Celtic territorial control. Military organisation within remaining Senones communities evolved to emphasise defensive capabilities and rapid mobilisation, rather than the offensive operations that had characterised earlier periods of tribal expansion. Weapon deposits from this period reveal standardisation of equipment that suggests centralised production and distribution systems designed to equip larger numbers of warriors with adequate gear, rather than providing elite equipment for individual champions. The prevalence of spears and javelins over expensive longswords indicates tactical adaptation to defensive warfare, while reflecting economic constraints that limited access to high-quality iron and skilled smiths. Training and tactical development focused on coordination between settlements and rapid response to external threats, rather than traditional Celtic emphasis on individual warrior prowess and ritualized combat. Archaeological evidence suggests the construction of signal systems using hilltop beacon sites that could provide rapid communication across the scattered Senones territories. These installations, typically featuring stone-lined fire pits with associated storage areas for fuel and supplies, indicate sophisticated planning for coordinated, defensive operations that required precise timing and communication. The recruitment of warriors expanded beyond traditional aristocratic volunteers to include broader segments of the population as military necessity overcame social restrictions that had previously limited combat participation to elite warriors. Archaeological evidence from weapon graves during this period shows wider distribution of military equipment across different social classes, while the presence of agricultural tools modified for combat use indicates desperate efforts to arm civilian populations for defensive operations. Diplomatic efforts to secure external support against mounting pressures achieved limited success as potential allies faced their own territorial threats, or calculated that accommodation with expanding powers offered better prospects than continued resistance. Senones envoys travelled to distant Celtic peoples seeking military assistance and political alliances, but these missions typically returned with expressions of sympathy rather than concrete commitments of military support. The fragmented nature of Celtic political organisation prevented effective coordination of resistance efforts, while allowing Roman diplomats to exploit individual tribal concerns and ambitions. The gradual integration of Germanic settlers into traditional Senones territories created complex demographic changes that challenged existing social structures while providing potential military reinforcement against Roman expansion. Archaeological evidence suggests that this integration occurred through negotiated agreements rather than violent conquest, with Germanic families receiving land grants in exchange for military service and loyalty to Senones' leadership. However, the long-term implications of this demographic change would prove destabilizing as Germanic cultural influences gradually modified traditional Celtic social organization. Celtic law codes, preserved through oral tradition and druidical instruction, provided frameworks for integrating foreign populations while maintaining tribal identity and political cohesion. These legal systems, emphasizing kinship obligations and territorial rights, offered mechanisms for adopting Germanic settlers into Celtic social structures through marriage alliances and formal adoption ceremonies. Archaeological evidence from mixed cemeteries suggests successful integration in many cases, with burial practices that combine Celtic and Germanic elements, while maintaining overall cultural coherence. Agricultural adaptation to changing demographic and political conditions required modification of traditional Celtic farming practices to support larger populations while maintaining defensive capabilities. Archaeological survey work reveals expansion of cultivated areas into previously marginal lands, suggesting population pressure that forced intensive exploitation of available agricultural resources. The construction of fortified farmsteads in exposed locations indicates efforts to maintain agricultural production despite military threats, while providing refuge for rural populations during periods of conflict. Technological innovation in agricultural implements and techniques reflected both necessity and opportunity as Senones communities adapted to new challenges while learning from Germanic and Roman agricultural practices. Iron ploughshares from this period show improved design that increased efficiency in heavy soil cultivation, while storage facilities reveal sophisticated preservation techniques that allowed communities to maintain food supplies during extended periods of siege or disruption. The development of hidden storage sites, typically located in remote areas away from major settlements, provided insurance against systematic destruction of agricultural resources by hostile forces. Craft production underwent significant changes as traditional markets disappeared and new demands emerged from changing military and social circumstances. Metalworking focused increasingly on weapons and agricultural tools rather than luxury goods and artistic objects, while pottery production emphasized utilitarian vessels designed for storage and transportation rather than decorative tableware. Archaeological evidence suggests consolidation of craft production in fortified centres where skilled artisans could work under protection while their products could be distributed efficiently to communities throughout the region. The social stratification that had characterized earlier Senones society faced pressure from military necessity and demographic change that elevated previously subordinate groups while challenging traditional aristocratic privileges. Archaeological evidence from elite burials during this period shows reduced grave goods and simplified burial practices that may indicate either economic constraints or ideological changes that emphasized collective survival over individual status display. The appearance of warrior graves with mixed Celtic and Germanic equipment suggests new forms of military leadership that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. Cultural transmission between generations became increasingly challenging as traditional educational systems faced disruption from military conflict and population displacement. Druidical schools, which had previously provided systematic instruction in law, religion and tribal history, operated under conditions of secrecy and constant threat that limited their effectiveness in preserving Celtic intellectual traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests increased emphasis on portable forms of cultural expression, such as decorated personal ornaments and weapons that could preserve artistic traditions even during periods of social disruption. The psychological impact of reports from Italy describing the destruction of Senones communities and the enslavement of their populations, created pervasive anxiety within remaining Celtic territories that influenced every aspect of social and political decision-making. These accounts, transmitted through survivor refugees and commercial contacts, provided graphic illustrations of Roman military capabilities while demonstrating the futility of direct military resistance against organised Roman legions. The knowledge that their Italian kinsmen had suffered complete political annihilation, despite their military prowess and strategic advantages, created profound uncertainty about the prospects for successful resistance. Marriage patterns and kinship relationships adapted to new realities as families sought to preserve bloodlines and cultural traditions while building alliances that might provide security during uncertain times. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites reveals changes in burial practices that suggest modification of traditional kinship structures, with collective burial areas that may indicate new forms of social organisation based on military units or defensive communities rather than traditional family groups. The presence of foreign grave goods in Celtic burials suggests intermarriage with Germanic settlers, while the persistence of traditional Celtic burial orientation indicates continued adherence to ancestral religious beliefs. The transformation of surviving Senones populations into subjects of the Roman provincial system occurred through a complex process of administrative integration that reflected both Roman pragmatism and the practical necessities of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Following the military destruction of organised Senones resistance in Italy and the gradual subjugation of their Gallic territories through Caesar's campaigns, Roman administrators faced the challenge of incorporating Celtic communities that possessed sophisticated social structures, legal traditions and economic systems into the standardized framework of provincial governance. The census records maintained by Roman officials reveal systematic efforts to document Senones populations, their territorial holdings and economic capabilities as the foundation for taxation and military recruitment obligations that would bind these communities to the Roman state. Roman provincial administration in former Senones territories followed established patterns developed through centuries of territorial expansion, yet adapted to accommodate the specific characteristics of Celtic social organisation and settlement patterns. The civitas system, which recognised existing tribal boundaries while subordinating them to Roman authority, provided a framework for preserving Celtic identity within imperial structures. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres established in former Senones territories reveals substantial construction projects including basilicas, forums, and administrative buildings that served both practical governmental functions and symbolic demonstrations of Roman power. These structures, typically built using Roman architectural principles but incorporating local materials and decorative elements, represented the physical manifestation of cultural transformation as Celtic communities adapted to new political realities. The appointment of Roman magistrates to oversee former Senones territories introduced standardized legal procedures and administrative practices that gradually replaced traditional Celtic governance mechanisms. However, Roman administrators recognized the practical value of existing Celtic institutions and frequently incorporated tribal leaders into the new administrative hierarchy through grants of Roman citizenship and appointment to subordinate governmental positions. Inscriptional evidence from throughout the former Senones regions documents numerous examples of Celtic nobles who received Roman names and titles while maintaining authority over their traditional followers, creating hybrid leadership structures that facilitated peaceful transition from tribal to provincial governance. Legal integration proved particularly complex as Roman jurisprudence encountered Celtic legal traditions that differed fundamentally in their approaches to property rights, personal obligations, and dispute resolution. Celtic law, preserved through oral tradition and administered by Druids, emphasized collective responsibility and restorative justice principles that contrasted sharply with Roman emphasis on individual accountability and punitive measures. Roman legal officials worked systematically to document Celtic legal customs while identifying areas where accommodation could occur without compromising essential Roman legal principles. Archaeological evidence from courthouse sites reveals the construction of specialised facilities designed to accommodate both Roman legal procedures and modified versions of traditional Celtic assemblies, where community disputes could be resolved through familiar mechanisms. Property law underwent particularly significant transformation as Roman concepts of individual ownership replaced Celtic systems based on kinship groups and collective territorial rights. The centuriation process, which divided agricultural land into standardised rectangular plots assigned to individual owners, fundamentally altered traditional Celtic settlement patterns while creating new opportunities for economic development. Archaeological survey work reveals extensive evidence of Roman field systems imposed over earlier Celtic agricultural landscapes, with boundary stones and drainage works that demonstrate systematic reorganisation of rural territories. However, Roman administrators often granted existing Celtic landholders individual title to territories they had previously held collectively, providing continuity of occupation while establishing clear ownership rights compatible with Roman legal requirements. Urban planning in former Senones territories reflected Roman architectural principles while accommodating existing settlement patterns and local preferences. The transformation of Celtic oppida into Roman-style towns required extensive construction projects that created employment opportunities for local populations while demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Senones reveal systematic urban redevelopment that preserved certain Celtic architectural elements while introducing Roman innovations, including hypocaust heating systems, aqueducts, and sewerage networks that improved living conditions and public health. Street layouts followed Roman grid patterns where topography permitted, but often incorporated existing Celtic routes and sacred sites to minimise disruption to establish community relationships. The construction of Roman-style public buildings provided focal points for community life while serving practical administrative and commercial functions. Basilicas served as courts and meeting halls where Roman legal procedures could be conducted alongside modified versions of traditional Celtic assemblies. Public baths introduced Roman social customs, while providing gathering places where Celtic and Roman residents could interact in informal settings. Archaeological evidence reveals that these facilities often incorporated decorative elements that combined Roman architectural motifs with Celtic artistic traditions, creating distinctive regional styles that reflected cultural synthesis rather than simple replacement of Celtic traditions with Roman alternatives. Religious syncretism between Celtic deities and Roman gods emerged as one of the most significant aspects of cultural transformation as Roman authorities sought to accommodate Celtic spiritual traditions while promoting loyalty to Roman religious institutions. The identification of Celtic gods with Roman counterparts provided a framework for religious continuity that eased the psychological impact of political subjugation while creating opportunities for cultural exchange between Celtic and Roman populations. Archaeological evidence from temple sites throughout former Senones territories reveals extensive construction of Romano-Celtic religious complexes that combined architectural elements from both traditions while serving the spiritual needs of mixed populations. The cult of Mercury Lugus exemplified this religious synthesis as the Roman god Mercury became identified with the Celtic deity Lugus, who had served as a patron of crafts, commerce, and intellectual pursuits throughout the Celtic world. Archaeological excavations at Mercury Lugus temple sites reveal distinctive architectural features that combined Roman stone construction techniques with Celtic circular sanctuary layouts. Votive inscriptions document the dedication of offerings by both Celtic and Roman worshippers, often using bilingual texts that preserved Celtic divine names alongside Roman religious formulas. The iconography associated with Mercury Lugus incorporated traditional Celtic symbols, including torques, wheels, and animal motifs, alongside Roman attributes such as the caduceus and winged sandals. Temple construction projects provided opportunities for Celtic craftsmen to adapt their skills to Roman architectural requirements while preserving traditional decorative techniques. Stone carving workshops associated with religious sites produced architectural sculpture that combined Roman figurative styles with Celtic abstract patterns, creating distinctive regional artistic traditions. Archaeological analysis of these sculptural remains reveals sophisticated understanding of Roman iconographic conventions, alongside continued use of Celtic symbolic systems that maintained cultural continuity despite political transformation. The employment of Celtic artisans in these prestigious projects demonstrated Roman recognition of Celtic artistic capabilities, while providing economic opportunities that facilitated peaceful integration. Religious festivals and ceremonial practices underwent gradual modification as Celtic seasonal celebrations were incorporated into Roman religious calendars through identification with corresponding Roman observances. The Celtic festival of Senones found expression within Roman religious practice through association with festivals honouring the dead, while Beltane celebrations merged with Roman spring festivals that emphasised agricultural renewal and fertility. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals continuity in ritual practices, including votive offerings and animal sacrifice, though conducted within architectural settings that reflected Roman religious aesthetics. The persistence of traditional Celtic ritual objects, including torques, cauldrons, and decorated weapons in Romano-Celtic religious contexts, demonstrates the successful preservation of essential spiritual practices within modified institutional frameworks. Druidical religious authority faced systematic Roman suppression due to its association with political resistance and its role in preserving Celtic cultural independence. However, Roman administrators recognized the practical value of Celtic religious knowledge, particularly in areas such as calendar calculation, agricultural timing, and traditional medicine. Archaeological evidence suggests that Druids adapted to Roman religious requirements through adoption of Roman priestly titles and incorporation into official religious hierarchies, where their expertise could serve Roman administrative needs. Inscriptional evidence documents Celtic religious specialists serving Roman temples while maintaining knowledge of traditional Celtic religious practices that continue to serve local community needs. Material culture transformation proceeded gradually as Celtic populations gained access to Roman manufactured goods, while adapting traditional craft techniques to new market demands and aesthetic preferences. Pottery production exemplified this cultural synthesis, as Celtic potters learned Roman wheel-throwing techniques and kiln construction, while maintaining traditional decorative motifs and vessel forms that served familiar cultural functions. Archaeological assemblages from domestic sites reveal gradual replacement of traditional Celtic handmade ceramics with wheel-thrown vessels that combined Roman technical sophistication with Celtic aesthetic preferences. The development of regional pottery styles that incorporated elements from both traditions created distinctive material culture that reflected successful cultural adaptation rather than simple replacement of Celtic traditions. Metalworking traditions underwent significant evolution as Celtic smiths adapted their sophisticated techniques to Roman market demands, while preserving traditional skills in weapon production and decorative metalwork. Archaeological evidence from the workshop sites reveals continued production of traditional Celtic ornaments, including torques and brooches, alongside Roman-style jewellery and household implements. The quality of metalwork from Romano-Celtic workshops often exceeded contemporary Roman standards, suggesting that Celtic technical expertise found ready markets within the broader Roman economy. Iron production increased substantially under Roman administration as improved transportation networks and standardized currency systems facilitated trade relationships that had been difficult to maintain under traditional Celtic political organisation. Textile production reflected similar patterns of cultural synthesis as Celtic weavers adapted traditional techniques to Roman fashion preferences while maintaining production of traditional Celtic garments for local markets. Archaeological evidence from textile workshops reveals the introduction of Roman-style looms alongside continued use of traditional Celtic weaving equipment. The discovery of textile fragments in waterlogged archaeological contexts demonstrates the production of high-quality woolen fabrics that combined Celtic dyeing techniques with Roman weaving patterns. The export of Celtic textiles to other parts of the Roman Empire provided economic opportunities that enhanced local prosperity, while spreading knowledge of Celtic artistic traditions throughout the Mediterranean world. Language adoption proceeded unevenly as Latin gradually became the language of administration and formal education, while Celtic languages persisted in domestic and rural contexts. Inscriptional evidence reveals extensive use of Latin for official purposes including legal documents, religious dedications and commercial transactions, while Celtic personal names and place names continued in common use. Bilingual inscriptions demonstrate transitional periods when both languages served overlapping functions within the same communities. Educational opportunities expanded significantly under Roman administration, as literacy in Latin provided access to legal, commercial, and administrative careers that had been unavailable under traditional Celtic social organisation. The establishment of Roman-style schools in former Senones territories provided systematic education in Latin language and literature, while creating opportunities for cultural exchange between Celtic and Roman intellectual traditions. Archaeological evidence from school sites reveals the construction of specialised educational facilities, including libraries and lecture halls, that served both practical educational functions and symbolic demonstrations of Roman cultural sophistication. However, these institutions often incorporated Celtic educational traditions, particularly in areas such as rhetoric and oral performance, where Celtic expertise complemented Roman educational objectives. Traditional Celtic practices faced gradual decline as Roman alternatives provided more efficient or attractive options for addressing practical needs and social aspirations. Celtic legal procedures, while preserved in modified form for local dispute resolution, gradually gave way to Roman legal mechanisms that offered more predictable outcomes and greater enforcement capabilities. Traditional Celtic military organisation became obsolete as Roman military service provided career opportunities and social advancement that exceeded anything available through traditional Celtic warrior culture. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits reveals declining production of traditional Celtic military equipment alongside increased adoption of Roman military gear by Celtic populations serving in auxiliary units. Agricultural practices underwent systematic modification as Roman techniques and crops were introduced alongside traditional Celtic farming methods. The introduction of Roman agricultural tools, including improved ploughs and harvesting equipment, increased productivity while reducing labour requirements. Archaeological evidence reveals the construction of Roman-style farm buildings, including granaries and processing facilities that enhance storage capabilities and food security. The cultivation of Mediterranean crops, including grapes and olives in areas where climate permitted, created new economic opportunities while diversifying agricultural production beyond traditional Celtic grain and livestock farming. Social stratification evolved as Roman citizenship and administrative positions provided new pathways for advancement, while traditional Celtic aristocratic privileges lost their practical significance. Archaeological evidence from elite residences reveals the adoption of Roman architectural styles and domestic arrangements that reflected changing social aspirations and cultural preferences. However, traditional Celtic symbols of status, including torques and decorated weapons, continue to appear in elite contexts, suggesting the preservation of Celtic identity markers alongside adoption of Roman status indicators. The integration of Celtic elites into Roman administrative hierarchies created hybrid social structures that combined elements from both traditions while serving the practical needs of provincial governance. The transformation of former Senones territories into integral components of the Roman Empire during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD witnessed the emergence of a distinctive Romano-Celtic military tradition as veterans from auxiliary units returned to their homeland communities carrying with them decades of experience gained through service in imperial campaigns across 3 continents. These soldiers, recruited initially from subjugated Celtic populations as part of their obligations to the Roman state, evolved into professional warriors whose expertise proved invaluable to Roman military operations from Britain to Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence from military discharge diplomas discovered throughout former Senones regions documents the systematic recruitment of Celtic youth into specialised auxiliary cohorts that served alongside regular legions while maintaining distinct tactical capabilities derived from traditional Celtic warfare methods. The cohors nasenionum established during the early Augustan period represented the most prestigious of these Celtic auxiliary units and served with distinction in campaigns throughout the empire for over 2 centuries. Military records preserved on bronze tablets reveal that this cohort participated in the conquest of Britain under Claudius and the Dacian campaigns of Trajan, accumulating battle honours that rivaled those of veteran legions. The unit's tactical specialty involved rapid reconnaissance operations and pursuit of fleeing enemies, roles that exploited traditional Celtic advantages in mobility and individual fighting skills while integrating these capabilities into Roman strategic frameworks. Tombstone inscriptions from veterans of this cohort document careers spanning 25 years of continuous service, with promotions through the centurionate that provided pathways to Roman citizenship and social advancement previously unavailable to Celtic populations. The military equipment issued to Celtic auxiliary units reflected sophisticated adaptation of traditional Celtic weapons and armour to Roman tactical requirements and manufacturing standards. Archaeological excavations at auxiliary fort sites have recovered standardised spatha swords that combine the length and cutting capability of traditional Celtic longswords with Roman metallurgical techniques and quality control standards. These weapons, measuring approximately 75 centimetres in length, provided Celtic auxiliaries with familiar fighting capabilities while meeting Roman specifications for durability and maintenance. Shield construction incorporated Celtic decorative motifs within Roman structural frameworks, creating distinctive unit identifications that preserve tribal artistic traditions while serving practical military functions. Body armour development for Celtic auxiliaries demonstrated remarkable innovation, as Roman military engineers adapted traditional Celtic protective equipment to imperial manufacturing capabilities and tactical requirements. Mail shirts produced in Roman armouries incorporated Celtic design elements, including distinctive shoulder reinforcements and decorative bronze fittings that maintained cultural identity while providing protection equivalent to legionary equipment. Helmet construction combined Roman engineering principles with Celtic aesthetic preferences, producing distinctive crested designs that allowed easy unit identification on crowded battlefields while incorporating protective features that had proven effective in Celtic warfare traditions. The tactical employment of Celtic auxiliary units within Roman military formations exploited their cultural strengths while compensating for traditional Celtic weaknesses in sustained formation fighting. Roman commanders typically deployed Celtic cohorts as advance guards and flank protection for legionary formations, roles that allowed Celtic warriors to employ their superior individual fighting skills and psychological intimidation while benefiting from Roman logistical support and strategic coordination. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites reveals that Celtic auxiliaries often served as the decisive factor in Roman victories through their ability to pursue broken enemy formations and prevent organised withdrawal that might allow future resistance. Training programs developed specifically for Celtic auxiliary recruits combined Roman military discipline with preservation of traditional Celtic fighting techniques that provided tactical advantages unavailable to conventional Roman forces. Military manuals preserved in fragmentary papyrus documents describe specialized instruction in mounted combat, individual weapon techniques, and rapid deployment operations that built upon Celtic cultural foundations while introducing Roman concepts of unit coordination and strategic thinking. The resulting hybrid military tradition produced warriors capable of operating effectively within Roman command structures while maintaining the fierce individual prowess that had made Celtic warriors legendary throughout the ancient world. The geographic distribution of Celtic auxiliary service reflected Roman strategic priorities as these units deployed to frontier regions where their specialized capabilities proved most valuable for imperial expansion and border security. Hadrian's Wall garrison records document extensive Celtic auxiliary presence in British frontier forts, where their familiarity with Celtic opponents and terrain provided crucial advantages for Roman defensive operations. Similarly, Celtic units served prominently in Germanic frontier regions, where their cultural similarities to tribal opponents allowed effective intelligence gathering and negotiation operations that complemented Roman military pressure. Archaeological evidence from frontier installations reveals the construction of specialized barracks and training facilities designed to accommodate Celtic auxiliary requirements while maintaining Roman military standards. Veterans returning to former Senones territories after completion of military service brought with them not only Roman citizenship and financial resources, but also extensive knowledge of imperial administrative practices, engineering techniques, and commercial opportunities that transformed local communities. Tombstone inscriptions document numerous examples of auxiliary veterans who established successful businesses, constructed substantial residences, and assumed leadership roles within their native communities while maintaining connections to former military comrades throughout the empire. The wealth accumulated through military service, combined with Roman citizenship privileges, created a new social class that bridged Celtic cultural traditions and Roman imperial opportunities. The construction activities undertaken by returning veterans demonstrated the practical application of engineering skills acquired during military service, as former soldiers supervised major infrastructure projects throughout their homeland regions. Archaeological evidence reveals the construction of Roman-style bath complexes, aqueduct systems, and road improvements funded by veteran associations and designed according to military engineering principles learned during frontier service. These projects not only improved local living conditions, but also provided employment opportunities for civilian populations, while demonstrating the tangible benefits of Roman imperial integration. Stone quarrying operations expanded significantly during this period, as veterans applied military engineering expertise to civilian construction projects that required substantial stone blocks and architectural elements. Agricultural innovation accompanied infrastructure development as veterans introduced farming techniques and crop varieties encountered during military service in diverse climatic regions throughout the empire. Archaeological analysis of pollen samples from this period reveals the introduction of new grain varieties and agricultural practices that increase productivity while diversifying local food production. Veterans who had served in Mediterranean regions brought knowledge of viticulture and olive cultivation that proved adaptable to local conditions, while those with experience in northern frontiers introduced improved livestock breeding techniques and cold weather crop management. The establishment of veteran agricultural colonies provided systematic demonstration of these innovations, while creating prosperous rural communities that served as models for broader agricultural development. Commercial networks established by veteran associations created unprecedented opportunities for trade relationships that connected former Senones territories to markets throughout the Roman Empire. Archaeological evidence from port facilities and commercial centres reveals substantial expansion of trading infrastructure during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, with warehouse construction and harbour improvements that facilitated maritime commerce with the distant provinces. Veterans utilised their military contacts and citizenship privileges to establish trading partnerships that provided access to luxury goods, raw materials, and manufactured products previously unavailable to Celtic populations. The standardisation of weights, measures and currency that accompanied Roman administration eliminated traditional barriers to long-distance commerce, while creating opportunities for systematic economic development. The archaeological record from Romano-Celtic settlement sites throughout former Senones territories reveals profound material culture changes that reflected both Roman cultural influence and the preservation of distinctive Celtic traditions within imperial frameworks. Excavations at rural farmsteads dating to the 1st century AD demonstrate the gradual adoption of Roman architectural techniques and domestic arrangements while maintaining traditional Celtic spatial organisation and decorative preferences. House construction incorporated Roman innovations including hypocaust heating systems and tile roofing while preserving Celtic circular building layouts and symbolic orientations that maintained cultural continuity. Kitchen areas reveal the adoption of Roman cooking techniques and dietary preferences alongside continued preparation of traditional Celtic foods using familiar methods and equipment. Pottery assemblages from domestic contexts demonstrate sophisticated cultural synthesis, as local potters adapted Roman wheel-throwing techniques and kiln construction to produce vessels that combined Roman functional efficiency with Celtic decorative traditions. Archaeological analysis reveals the development of distinctive regional pottery styles that incorporated traditional Celtic motifs, including spirals, animal figures, and geometric patterns within Roman vessel forms designed for specific functional purposes. The quality and artistic sophistication of these hybrid ceramics often exceeded contemporary Roman provincial standards, suggesting that Celtic artistic traditions enhanced rather than simply adapted to Roman cultural requirements. Metalworking traditions underwent remarkable development as Celtic smiths applied their traditional expertise to Roman market demands while preserving specialised techniques that had distinguished Celtic craftsmanship for centuries. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites reveals continued production of traditional Celtic ornaments, including torques and brooches, alongside Roman-style jewellery and household implements that served expanding commercial markets. The discovery of sophisticated smelting facilities and tool assemblages demonstrates technological advancement that combined Celtic metallurgical knowledge with Roman engineering principles and quality control standards. Iron production increased dramatically as improved transportation networks and standardised currency systems created markets for Celtic metalwork throughout the Roman Empire. Religious architecture throughout former Senones territories reflected the successful synthesis of Celtic spiritual traditions with Roman religious institutions, as temple construction projects combined architectural elements from both cultures while serving the spiritual needs of mixed populations. Archaeological excavations at Romano-Celtic temple complexes reveal distinctive architectural features that incorporated Roman stone construction techniques with Celtic circular sanctuary layouts and symbolic orientations. The Temple of Mercury Lugus at Senones exemplified this architectural synthesis, with its combination of Roman columnar facades and Celtic circular inner sanctuaries that preserved traditional ritual spaces while providing impressive public architecture that demonstrated community prosperity and cultural sophistication. Votive deposits from these religious sites document the continued practice of traditional Celtic religious customs within Roman institutional frameworks as worshippers dedicated offerings that combined Roman manufactured goods with traditional Celtic ritual objects. Archaeological analysis of these deposits reveals the persistence of Celtic religious practices, including weapon offerings, animal sacrifice, and seasonal celebrations, while demonstrating adaptation to Roman religious calendars and ceremonial requirements. The bilingual nature of many votive inscriptions indicates successful preservation of Celtic divine names and religious concepts within Latin religious formulas that satisfied Roman administrative requirements. Educational developments within former Senones territories created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual advancement, as Roman-style schools provided systematic instruction in Latin language and literature while incorporating Celtic educational traditions that emphasized oral performance and memorization. Archaeological evidence from school sites reveals the construction of specialized educational facilities, including libraries and lecture halls, that served both practical educational functions and symbolic demonstrations of community cultural aspirations. However, these institutions often preserve Celtic intellectual traditions, particularly in areas such as rhetoric and legal reasoning, where Celtic expertise complemented Roman educational objectives while maintaining cultural continuity. The preservation of Celtic place names throughout the Roman provincial period demonstrates the systematic accommodation of Celtic cultural identity within imperial administrative frameworks, as Roman officials recognized the practical value of existing geographic terminology while establishing standardized administrative boundaries. Inscriptional evidence reveals the continued use of Celtic settlement names alongside Latin administrative designations, creating bilingual geographic terminology that served both local cultural needs and imperial administrative requirements. Archaeological survey work has identified numerous examples of Roman administrative centres that preserved Celtic names while adopting Roman urban planning principles and architectural styles. Road construction projects undertaken during the early imperial period created systematic transportation networks that connected former Senones territories to major Roman commercial and military routes while preserving access to traditional Celtic sacred sites and seasonal gathering places. Archaeological analysis of Roman road construction reveals sophisticated engineering that accommodated existing Celtic settlement patterns while establishing efficient transportation corridors for military and commercial purposes. Bridge construction and river crossing improvements facilitated trade relationships while maintaining access to traditional Celtic religious sites that continue to serve important cultural functions within the Roman provincial system. Urban planning in major administrative centres reflected Roman architectural principles while accommodating Celtic social organisation and cultural preferences through modified street layouts and public building arrangements. The transformation of Sens into a major Roman administrative centre required extensive construction projects that preserved certain Celtic architectural elements, while introducing Roman innovations, including forum complexes, basilicas, and public bath facilities. Archaeological excavations reveal systematic urban redevelopment that created employment opportunities for local populations, while demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities and administrative efficiency. Street layouts followed Roman grid patterns where topography permitted, but often incorporated existing Celtic routes and sacred sites to minimize disruption to establish community relationships. Economic specialization increased significantly under Roman administration as improved transportation networks and standardized currency systems created opportunities for regional economic development based on local resource advantages and traditional Celtic craft expertise. Archaeological evidence reveals the expansion of ceramic production facilities, metalworking workshops, and textile manufacturing centres that served markets throughout the Roman Empire while providing employment opportunities for local populations. The development of commercial agriculture focused on crops and livestock products that could be efficiently transported to distant markets while maintaining subsistence production that ensured local food security during periods of commercial disruption. The medieval chroniclers who first attempted to reconstruct the history of ancient Gaul possessed only fragmentary knowledge of the Senones, drawing primarily from classical sources that had survived the collapse of Roman administrative records and the subsequent disruption of scholarly traditions during the barbarian invasions. The earliest systematic account appears in Gregory of Tours' Historia Francorum, written in the late 6th century, where the Senones receive brief mention as one of the Gallic peoples who had resisted Roman conquest before eventually submitting to imperial authority. Gregory's treatment reflects the limited source material available to early medieval scholars, relying heavily on Livy's account of the sack of Rome while lacking access to the detailed ethnographic descriptions that had been preserved in works by Caesar and Tacitus. The chronicler's primary interest lay in establishing the genealogical connections between ancient Gallic peoples and the Frankish kingdoms of his own era, leading to speculative assertions about Senones' descendants that reflected medieval political concerns rather than historical accuracy. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries witnessed renewed scholarly interest in classical antiquity that brought greater attention to Celtic peoples as predecessors of contemporary European populations. Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni contains references to ancient Gallic tribes that demonstrate familiarity with classical sources previously unavailable to earlier medieval scholars, though his treatment of the Senones remains cursory and derivative. More significantly, the anonymous chronicle of Fredegar preserves what appears to be independent tradition regarding Celtic settlements along the Seine and Yonne rivers, describing ancient fortified sites that correspond remarkably well to archaeological discoveries made more than a millennium later. These chronicles suggest the persistence of local oral traditions that preserved geographical and cultural knowledge about pre-Roman populations despite the profound social and political transformations that had occurred during the intervening centuries. The scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries produced the first systematic attempts to synthesize classical and medieval sources into comprehensive historical narratives that included detailed treatment of Celtic peoples. Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Historiale devoted substantial attention to the Senones within its broader account of Gallic history, drawing upon newly available manuscripts of Caesar's Commentarii and Pliny's Natural History that provided more detailed ethnographic information than had been accessible to earlier scholars. Vincent's methodology, while primitive by modern standards, demonstrated genuine historical consciousness in its attempts to reconcile conflicting source materials and establish chronological frameworks for ancient events. His description of Senones' territorial boundaries and settlement patterns, based on careful analysis of classical geographic sources, proved remarkably accurate when compared to modern archaeological evidence. Renaissance humanist scholars approached Celtic history with unprecedented, critical methodology that sought to distinguish reliable historical evidence from medieval legendary materials that had accumulated around ancient peoples. Étienne Pasquier's Recherche de la France, published in 1560, represented the first systematic attempt to locate Senones settlements through careful analysis of place name evidence combined with classical geographic descriptions. Pasquier's identification of Sens as the ancient Agedincum and his mapping of Senones' territorial boundaries demonstrated sophisticated understanding of historical geography that would not be significantly improved until the development of modern archaeological techniques. His work established methodological principles for Celtic studies that emphasize primary source analysis and geographic correlation over speculative reconstruction based on legendary materials. The antiquarian movement of the 17th and 18th centuries produced increasingly sophisticated investigations of Celtic material remains as scholars began systematic examination of ancient fortifications, burial sites, and artifact deposits throughout former Gallic territories. Dom Bernard de Montfaucon's L'Antiquité expliquée included detailed illustrations of Celtic coins, weapons, and ornaments that provided the first systematic catalogue of Senones material culture based on actual archaeological specimens rather than classical literary descriptions. These early antiquarian studies, while lacking modern stratigraphic methodology, preserved crucial information about artefact context and site associations that would prove invaluable for later archaeological interpretation. The documentation of coin hoards and burial assemblages discovered during agricultural activities created databases that revealed patterns of Senones settlement and cultural development invisible to classical authors who had observed these peoples only during periods of political crisis. The emergence of scientific archaeology during the 19th century revolutionized understanding of Celtic civilization through systematic excavation techniques that could recover detailed information about daily life, economic activities, and social organization. The discovery of the Vix burial in 1953 represented a watershed moment in Senones archaeology, revealing the extraordinary wealth and international connections of Celtic elites during the 6th century BC. The massive bronze crater found in this burial, manufactured in Greek workshops and transported over vast distances to reach its final resting place in a Celtic grave, demonstrated the sophistication of trade networks that connected Senones territories to Mediterranean civilizations centuries before Roman conquest. Subsequent analysis of the burial assemblage revealed details about Celtic metalworking techniques, textile production, and social hierarchy that provided unprecedented insights into pre-Roman Gallic society. Archaeological investigations at Sens throughout the 20th century gradually revealed the continuous occupation sequence that connected prehistoric Celtic settlements to Roman administrative centres and medieval urban development. Excavations beneath the cathedral revealed substantial remains of Roman buildings constructed over earlier Celtic settlement layers, while systematic survey work in the surrounding countryside identified numerous rural sites that preserved evidence of Senones agricultural practices and settlement patterns. The discovery of Celtic coin moulds and metalworking facilities demonstrated the sophistication of Senones craft production, while analysis of imported pottery and luxury goods revealed the extent of their commercial relationships with distant regions. These archaeological discoveries provided material evidence that confirmed and expanded upon classical literary accounts, while revealing aspects of Celtic society that had been invisible to ancient authors. The development of scientific dating techniques during the mid-20th century enabled archaeologists to establish precise chronologies for Celtic cultural development that clarified the relationship between different phases of Senones history. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from settlement sites and burials provided absolute dates that could be correlated with historical events described in classical sources, while dendrochronological analysis of wooden structures revealed detailed sequences of construction and occupation that demonstrated the stability and prosperity of Senones communities. These dating techniques confirmed that major Celtic settlements had been established along the Seine and Yonne rivers several centuries before the earliest classical references to the Senones, suggesting that their historical significance extended far beyond their dramatic conflicts with Rome. Modern scholarly debates about Senones chronology have focused particularly on the relationship between archaeological evidence for Celtic settlement and the historical accounts of tribal migrations that brought Gallic peoples into Italy during the 4th century BC. Some scholars argue that the archaeological record demonstrates continuous occupation of Senones territories throughout the period when classical sources describe major population movements, suggesting that only portions of the tribe participated in Italian campaigns while substantial populations remained in their traditional homeland. Others maintain that the archaeological evidence supports the classical accounts of large-scale migration, pointing to apparent discontinuities in settlement patterns and material culture that coincide with the chronology of Italian campaigns described by Livy and other ancient historians. The territorial extent of Senones control has generated considerable scholarly controversy as archaeologists have attempted to correlate material culture distributions with the political boundaries described in classical sources. Excavations throughout the Seine and Yonne valleys have revealed Celtic settlements with similar material culture across a much broader geographic area than the territories specifically attributed to the Senones by Roman authors, raising questions about whether classical tribal designations reflected actual political control or simply represented Roman administrative convenience. The discovery of Celtic oppida at sites such as Bibracte and Alesia, traditionally associated with other Gallic tribes, has revealed material culture similarities that suggest extensive cultural exchange or possible political relationships between different Celtic peoples that were not fully understood by classical observers. Archaeological evidence for Senones' participation in Italian campaigns has proven particularly challenging to interpret, as the material culture recovered from Celtic sites in Italy shows clear connections to Gallic traditions, while displaying local adaptations that developed during centuries of Italian residence. Excavations at Senigallia and other sites along the Adriatic coast have revealed Celtic settlement layers that demonstrate substantial population presence rather than temporary military occupation, supporting classical accounts of permanent Senones colonisation rather than simple raiding expeditions. However, the archaeological evidence also suggests continuous cultural evolution and adaptation to Italian conditions that created distinctive Romano-Celtic material culture traditions that differed significantly from contemporary developments in Gallic territories. Contemporary understanding of Celtic civilization has been profoundly influenced by archaeological discoveries that have revealed the sophistication and complexity of pre-Roman European societies. The Senones, as one of the most historically visible Celtic peoples due to their dramatic conflicts with Rome, have served as a crucial case study for understanding broader patterns of Celtic social organisation, economic development, and cultural achievement. Archaeological evidence from Senones territories has demonstrated that Celtic societies possessed sophisticated metallurgical techniques, complex trade networks, and advanced agricultural practices that supported substantial populations and enabled significant cultural achievements. The quality of Celtic craftsmanship revealed through archaeological investigation has challenged earlier scholarly assumptions about the primitive nature of pre-Roman European societies while demonstrating the cultural losses that accompanied Roman conquest and assimilation. The role of the Senones in the Roman conquest of Gaul has been reassessed through archaeological evidence that reveals the complexity of Romano-Celtic relationships during the period of imperial expansion. Rather than simple military conquest followed by cultural replacement, the archaeological record demonstrates gradual processes of cultural synthesis that preserved many Celtic traditions within Roman institutional frameworks. The discovery of Romano-Celtic temples, hybrid artistic traditions, and bilingual inscriptions reveals that Celtic cultural identity persisted for centuries after political subjugation, adapting to Roman administrative requirements while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected pre-conquest traditions. This evidence has encouraged scholarly re-evaluation of Roman imperial policies and their long-term cultural consequences throughout the Celtic world. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed previously unknown aspects of Senones society that were invisible to classical observers and unavailable to earlier scholars. Environmental archaeology has reconstructed ancient climate conditions and agricultural practices that explain the economic foundations of Celtic prosperity, while scientific analysis of metal artifacts has revealed sophisticated trade networks that connected Celtic territories to distant sources of raw materials and finished goods. The application of GIS technology to archaeological survey data has enabled systematic analysis of settlement patterns and territorial organisation that provides new insights into Celtic political structures and social organisation. These technological advances continue to generate new discoveries that expand understanding of Celtic civilization, while raising new questions about the relationship between archaeological evidence and historical interpretation. The legacy of the Senones in contemporary historical consciousness reflects their dramatic role in some of the most memorable events of ancient history, particularly the sack of Rome that demonstrated the vulnerability of emerging Roman power to Celtic military capabilities. Their story embodies broader themes of cultural contact, imperial expansion, and the complex processes through which diverse peoples were incorporated into expanding Mediterranean civilizations. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new aspects of their sophisticated society, challenging simplistic narratives of barbarian invasions and cultural replacement, while demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of Celtic traditions within changing political circumstances. The Senones thus represent not merely an ancient people whose political independence was eventually extinguished, but a complex society whose cultural contributions were preserved and transformed through centuries of historical development that connected prehistoric European traditions to the foundations of medieval and modern European civilization. The modern understanding of the Senones ultimately transcends their classical reputation as fierce warriors who challenged Roman power, revealing them as representatives of a sophisticated Celtic civilization that made lasting contributions to European cultural development. Their story demonstrates the complexity of ancient cultural interactions and the inadequacy of simple conquest narratives for understanding the processes through which diverse peoples and traditions were integrated into larger political and cultural systems. As archaeological investigation continues to reveal new aspects of their society and historical significance, the Senones serve as a reminder of the rich cultural heritage that preceded Roman imperial expansion and the remarkable adaptability of human societies facing fundamental political and cultural transformation.